In this course, we're going to go into saturation in depth. And by the end, you're going to come away with a ton of clarity on what saturation is, how it works, but also how to actually use it in your mixes and masters to improve the quality and also to get creative and take your tracks to the next level, not just in terms of quality, but also in emotional impact and artistic intent. All right, we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive in. So first of all, what is saturation? You might have heard this term before. You might have also heard distortion, overdrive. They're all effectively the same thing. And if you distill it down to what is actually happening at the core is we're introducing new harmonic information. The way we do that is at multiples of the original source. So let's say we have a frequency of 100 hertz. When we add saturation, what you'll see is on our graph down here, right now we've just got 100 hertz. We'll see new overtones, new intervals of that frequency. So you can see that coming up there at 300 hertz. So that would be considered a third order harmonic. Second order would be 200, third order 300, fourth order 400, 500, etc. When it's an even number, so second, fourth, sixth order harmonics, we call those even harmonics. When it's an odd number, like we see here, 300, we call that odd order harmonics. As I drive this more, we'll see more come up. And then you can see here, eventually we get this really strong third order. This starts creeping up here, a fifth order. We also start getting a little bit of a second order. So now we're getting some even harmonics as well as odd, but it's still mostly odd. And then as we really push this, we can see these kind of moving around and different kind of patterns for initially just those odd order harmonics come up, and then those kind of stop, go down here at 500, and then we see some of these come up a little bit more prominently at 200, 400, etc. So that's really all it boils down to. It's actually extremely simple at its core. We're either adding odd or even order harmonics. So now let's have a listen to how that actually sounds. So first we just have a sine wave at 100 hertz. This is going to sound extremely clean. It's a singular sine wave. As we drive it, you can hear it almost sounds like an interval, like harmonically, like playing two different notes. That's effectively what's happening. As we introduce more and more, it sounds less like an interval. We've got so many now that it starts to just sound distorted. If we change the bass frequency, so obviously this is a simple example, one frequency. Now imagine this applied to an entire mix where we have lots of different frequencies happening all at the same time, coming in and out, lots changing. And that's where we start to get a very kind of different sound. So this is with no distortion. Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through my bloodstream. Now let's add distortion. Gotta feel now to mess it up. That's all that saturation is. Now what we're going to cover in a moment is where you go with this. How far do you go? Do you go all the way to this kind of overdrive distortion effects? Gotta feel now to mess it up. Or do you do something subtle? Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through my bloodstream. Got me breaking down to bone and dust. Use fear for a change, view for my body. So we can push it all the way up here and get this obvious distortion effect, but we don't have to do that. We could just bring it down on the left side over here, add a little bit, and it's not going to be noticeable distortion. Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through my bloodstream. Got me breaking down to bone and dust. What's happening now is it's just changing the tone. We don't perceive that as, oh, this is distorted or an overdrive effect. Instead, we're just hearing that new harmonic content that's been generated that's kind of tucked in underneath the mix. So that brings us on to the two approaches to using saturation. One is for kind of subtle tonal use, where you're adding some harmonics but not in a way that's creating that noticeable distortion effect. Instead, we're kind of using it as an alternative to EQ, but it's doing something very different under the hood. EQ can only boost or cut what's there, whereas with saturation, we're adding new content. Or the second approach is to use it as a creative effect, where we are literally distorting, for example, a distorted guitar. Or what happens quite a lot in modern production, there's a big kind of phase right now of a lot of music coming out that has this kind of very overdriven, distorted sound in a mixing context. So not a distorted guitar, but the whole mix might sound really distorted, or the vocal might just be really distorted. And we kind of cross over from this kind of subtle use that you might see in a lot of hardware. That's the reason why hardware tends to sound nice, is because it's adding saturation, it's adding harmonic content differently between transistors, transformers, valves. And we start to push beyond that into this realm of using those tools, but really aggressively as more of a creative effect. So that's the two approaches. Normally, you're going to be doing the creative stuff a lot more in the production phase, but again, it's becoming even more common now in mixing, just adding a ton of saturation to everything or even an entire mix. I'm going to show you that at the very end, a mix I did recently where the client wanted this kind of really aggressive saturated sound. And then your more subtle tonal application of saturation tends to be in the mixing and mastering process. It's kind of similar to reverb. A lot of the time, if you are going to apply a really heavy reverb effect to a vocal or a guitar to the point where it's really noticeable and washed out, that tends to be more of a production decision. And then when we are mixing, it tends to be this subtle thing we're using a little bit more for depth and to add some stereo width and space without necessarily just completely washing things out. And saturation is similar, where you tend to use it more as a creative effect in production, more of a subtle effect in mixing and mastering. Now, one more note I want to add here is you can actually stack these applications. So it's not like you just do one subtle application of saturation in your mix and you're done. Instead, it's going to be a little bit of saturation sometimes when you're recording. If you're going through a preamp, there's been a lot of discussions recently online about preamps, and do preamps actually sound different. And again, that all boils down for the most part to saturation. There are going to be tonal EQ differences between different preamps. If you remove those and had a preamp that was flat, it wasn't adding an EQ, or you don't change the EQ on the way in, the main thing that's going to cause differences between different preamps is just their saturation profiles, the amount of odd and even harmonics that they add, which is going to be different between transistors, transformers, valves, etc. And we'll get onto that in a second. But you tend to record with a little bit of saturation coming in. And then you might add saturation on individual channels. You might also add a little bit more on buses. For example, you might be saturating your snare on the way in, and then you might be running it through an 1176 compressor that also adds saturation. You might even add just some dedicated saturation to that snare. You might then also have saturation on the drum bus. And then finally, we might also saturate the mix bus when we're mixing, and again when mastering. So these little tonal additions stack up over time. We're constantly introducing new harmonic information, and that can create quite a noticeable difference when you look at the whole picture, even if the individual applications are quite minor. And the same with creative applications. It's not just a case of, you have to distort the entire mix. It might be that you're distorting the vocal, the guitar quite aggressively as a kind of noticeable effect to change the feel and the vibe of the track in a way that's very intentional. And that's something you can stack in multiple places. I want to show you one more example here of the contrast between those two different styles. This time I'm going to use Open Compressor 2. So anyone who is an Open Compressor user, you're getting a sneak peek here at version 2, which is going to be ready in the next few months. Currently in beta, so some of this might change. But the reason I want to use this is because we have these odd and even controls. So in alignment with everything I just told you, I wanted this plugin, which I built, to be extremely simple and kind of reduce things down to first principles. So instead of having tape, transformer, valve modes, instead we just distill it down to odd. And as we increase that, you can see the odd harmonics coming up and even. So this is just a really good visual aid as we're talking about this. I'm going to be using this a lot in this video. And if we switch our kind of fast modes here to bright, for example, we've got 10 and 25%. So not a ton. I'll turn off the compressor so that all we're hearing here is the saturation. So this is going to be our kind of subtle enhancement style. So it just kind of opens everything up If we switch now to warm, it's going to flip so that it's more odd than even, and then we can compare the two. So in warm, it's going to be more odd. In bright, it's going to be more even, and I'll come back to that in a second. So it's reasonably subtle, and we're going to talk in a second about how you dial this in and actually set this up on any saturation plugin. But to contrast that, this is what kind of I would consider a more creative application would be in a mixing context if we wanted to give it a really kind of dirty sound. So again, even in a mixing context, it's still relatively subtle. We're not going to be crushing the entire mix, but that's where we start to get into the territory of what I would say is a lot more intentional production decision around how we want the track to sound. I'll show you some examples of this actually, where it starts to cross into that territory. So we've got this artist, Sleep Club. You can hear it starting to break up. Especially when that kick comes in. Obviously, the guitars themselves are quite distorted. But listen to the drums. And the bass as well, you can hear that breaking up. Saturation is always a lot more notable on low end because we're not used to hearing it. We're used to hearing cleaner low end. And then the vocals are just kind of quite hot. So that's something I would consider creative application, more as a noticeable creative effect. I'll give you one more example. This is what's really popular right now that's kind of in this territory. If anything, McG kind of started this trend. There might have been some other stuff that came prior, but this is what is, yeah, again, very kind of like on trend at the moment. So this is a good example here. On this one, focus on the vocals. It'll be very obvious. The guitar too.
If you wanna go, then baby go wild. I can shift shapes, but I can deny.
So that's kind of a cleaner sound. We would expect that to be clean. That last track is pretty heavy, so we're not as surprised by the distortion. On this, it's a bit more noticeable. I'm going to show you one more example because this is just a really cool track where, again, it's more kind of like folk country-esque, so we wouldn't expect it as much, and that's what makes it a bit more novel. And again, think about how this impacts the emotion of the track. It's not just about trying to get the highest fidelity possible. Sometimes it is. A lot of music is like that. We wouldn't want distortion. We would want it really clean, maybe more kind of hip-hop, but even then now hip-hop is commonly like very saturated. But at the same time, that saturation, it really does impact the emotion and how the track feels quite a bit more than other tools. So focus on that when you listen to this. Again, you can hear it everywhere. The guitars are distorted, but there's like an edginess to them. The drums are pretty saturated.
If you know me like you say you do, you'd be humming along.
You can hear it on the vocals as well, they're breaking up a bit.
If you know me like you say you do, you just tell me I'm wrong. You just tell me the truth.
So hopefully that helps you kind of see the difference or the crossover. I would show you some examples of kind of subtle application in existing music, but it would be very difficult because it's everywhere. Anything that was recorded through a nice preamp is going to have saturation. Anything that was mastered on any outboard equipment is going to have saturation. Pretty much anything that you listen to on the radio is going to have more of that kind of subtle tonal application. So it's not as easy to find an example of that other than what I showed you before, where you could kind of hear the tonal shift, hear it opening up, but it's not kind of this noticeable distortion. Now let's talk about how to set up your saturation plugins. So most saturation plugins have two main controls. There's going to be the drive, which is how much saturation you're applying. That's going to be your primary control. And then there's going to be some kind of tonal control. In the stock Logic saturation, we have different models, so they're going to sound slightly different. We also have a low cut and a high cut. Sometimes you'll just see a tone knob where you can make it darker or brighter. That will vary from plugin to plugin, but the main thing is going to be your drive knob. That's what's going to dictate how much saturation is applied. So something that's really important to be aware of with saturation is your gain going into it is also going to have quite a big impact. Different plugins, different hardware has been developed differently. Some of them are going to be more susceptible to this. It just depends if they've got kind of a fixed threshold in there where everything over a certain amount gets saturated. That could be at a different point depending on the plugin. But to show you an example here, right now we're going through Chroma Glow. We're at -10 on our 100 hertz sine wave. If we have 0 drive, there doesn't seem to be any intervals, harmonics being added. Now they could be really quiet and we just can't see them. But as we start to increase the drive, we can see that they start to appear. Now, what happens as I actually push this level up, even though my drive is still at 0, you'll see that we start to get this third order harmonic and then even some fifth and fourth order and second order harmonics creeping in. So it's just something to be aware of. There is no right or wrong. If your level's hotter, then you probably are just going to get more saturation. You're not going to have to add as much drive. If your level's lower, you might have to add more drive to get an equivalent amount. So you can see here, even at a low level with 100% drive, we're still basically just getting that 100 hertz because everything else is going to be so quiet that it's not coming up. And then we push that level a bit more and now suddenly we're getting that drive. And if you want something to be really saturated, you're going to have to make sure the level going into it is adequate. Because if we want this to sound like really distorted, but our level going into it is quite low and then we crank the drive to 100%, we're still not really getting much. So we have to push our level into it. Now, normally the way you would do this, if it wasn't a test oscilloscope, is just through a gain plugin, which is how you're going to be doing most of your gain staging anyway. So if you had a source that was just pretty quiet, let's say it's averaging down at like -25, you might have addressed that already when you were doing your gain staging. So if you have a process where, you open up your mix project, you check for any channels that are too low and bring them up to around like -18, averaging or peaking up to like -5, then you're going to be in a better spot. But even that could be quite low. So let's say let's do -18 because that's a common place that people go at. So if we're averaging around -18 and then we bring in our drive, we're still not getting a crazy amount. So you would then just go to your gain plugin, increase the gain going into your saturation, and now we're getting a lot more. So it's just something to be aware of. That level is going to interplay with the drive. So in terms of the step-by-step process, it's just going to be a case of load up your saturation plugin. I would then say add more drive than you think you're going to use, kind of go a little bit too far, then play around with the tone controls. The way I generally do this is I'll just flick between them and see which ones I like. We're going to talk a little bit more about Distressor, which is probably my favorite saturation plugin, later in the video. But in Distressor, I tend to just flick between the modes. Just see what works in that context and with the source material that you're working. It's going to be easier to hear those differences because you've made it a little bit over the top. Once you've found the kind of the tone control that you like, you can then pull your drive back down to where you actually want it, either quite low for that kind of subtle tonal shift, or you might want to keep it really aggressive if it's being used more creatively. Now with something like Open Compressor that has odd and even, and there are other plugins out there that have odd and even controls, it's the same idea. We're adding drive, we're adding saturation on one knob. It's just that we've kind of split that out into the two functions, one drive knob for odd and one drive knob for even. And again, for the most part, I would recommend you just try both, just see how they sound different because they have different characteristics. Some people say that even is less musical and generally odd sounds a little bit smoother. I haven't found that to be the case because there's other factors that come into play that have more impact. So generally what I've found is any plugins or hardware where you can control the balance between odd and even, it sounds different on all of them. And actually on Open Compressor, the way we've set up, I find that odd sounds a little bit warmer. So when we go to warm mode, we've got more odd, and then even sounds a little bit brighter. However, on other plugins I've used, it's kind of the inverse. And the reason for that is it depends on the exact profile of how they've been set up. So we have kind of the fact that it's odd or even, but then we could have either a steady decay like this, where it just kind of goes down a little bit each time. Or when we were looking at Chroma Glow, we could see that there was a slightly different profile. So for example, here, our third is quite loud, and then our fifth is quiet, and then it kind of goes up again for this one and this one. So those differences between the individual overtones, between the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, etc., to my ears, that's the thing that has the biggest impact on how it sounds tonally. So I don't think you can really make a kind of general rule of like odd always sounds one way, even always sounds another. I think you just have to try them out on different sources and see how they sound. So for example, again, we can use a similar approach where we just like dial it in aggressively and see how it sounds and then take it back from there. So let's listen to this. Compared to even. Not only is it a different tonal characteristic, the actual sound of the saturation there was different. Even sounded a lot kind of rounder and more aggressive. It was breaking up in a way that sounded a bit more aggressive, whereas odd sounded kind of like this warm breaking up where it was a little bit less noticeable. We can hear it more in the low end. Whereas that almost has this kind of crunchiness or this kind of warbly effect. So again, it's going to be different between different plugins depending on how they work, or different with different hardware depending on what components they're using. And we're going to cover that in a second. But so much to say, when you have separate odd and even, same concepts, we've just got a drive control. You can increase that, play around with your tone, and then back it off to the point that you want it. Once you've dialed in your drive and your tone, there's one more setting to think about that's really important when it comes to saturation, more so than any other form of processing, and that's oversampling. And the main reason oversampling exists is because of saturation. There are other applications where oversampling is helpful, especially if you're doing any time-based warping where you're really stretching things out. Or on Open Compressor, for example, we have oversampling for the compressor, so that if you do really fast attack times that would be normally less than one sample, it will oversample so that we can actually like process those. But the reason oversampling exists for the most part is for saturation. So we need to talk about it here. I'm not going to go super deep into it. The fundamental idea is when we're running at 44.1 kilohertz, we have the Nyquist frequency. And to find the Nyquist frequency, you half the sample rate. So at 44.1, the Nyquist frequency is around 22 kilohertz. What that means is we can't actually have any information above 22 kilohertz, which normally is fine because that's above the range of human hearing. We can't really hear anything up there. But if you are adding saturation, you're going to be creating overtones that could very much be above that threshold. For example, if we run a 10 kilohertz sine wave and we add saturation, if you imagine the third order harmonic on that is going to be 30 kilohertz. Equally, if you have some 15 kilohertz in your mix, which could be the top end of your cymbals, the vocal, that kind of stuff, and you're adding even just a second order harmonic, now we're at 30 kilohertz. So at that point, you might think, well, why is that a problem? If we have this Nyquist frequency, that means in the digital realm, we just can't get any information above 22 kilohertz at 44.1 kilohertz sample rate. Don't we just lose that? But then we have something called aliasing, which is where the overtones that were being generated there at like 30 kilohertz, they bounce back off the Nyquist frequency. And without getting too much into the theory, you can actually see it quite clearly. So I've got Saturn here loaded up, not in oversampling mode. Now, if we do a 10 kilohertz sine wave, let's make that a bit louder, and we add a little bit of drive, you can see here we're getting this second order at 20 kilohertz. But if we really drive it, already now you can see something poking up here at 2 kilohertz, which doesn't make sense, right? We're at 10K, we're generating harmonics above that. Saturation never generates harmonics below the frequency that you're feeding into it. So why is that happening? Well, that's the aliasing. It's going up. So that would be, all the way up here somewhere. If you imagine this is going to be at 40K, because we're introducing like a fourth order harmonic on 10K, so that'd be 40K. Instead, that gets bounced down to 2K. And if we keep driving it, we're going to have even more of that. 6K, here's probably around 16K. Now, it's not these harmonics that are being reflected back down sound bad particularly. It's just that they're kind of undesirable. And depending on the frequency, it's going to be at kind of weird intervals. So if we actually had just 7,896 hertz, the relationship now between these is going to be kind of strange. It's not going to be a second or third or fourth order harmonic. It's going to be something different. And you can see as we change the frequency, the gaps between these changes. So people kind of describe this as like an ugly sound because they're kind of irrelevant to the source material. So how do we fix this? Well, the only reason this happens is because the Nyquist frequency is always at half the sample rate. So if we're working at 44.1 kilohertz, our Nyquist frequency is at 22.05 kilohertz. If we were working at a higher sample rate, say 96 kilohertz, well, now our Nyquist frequency would be at 48 kilohertz. So it would be a lot less of a problem because it would only be anything above 48K now that was getting reflected down. And also it's got to travel a lot further to get there and come back. So the volume of that reflection is going to be a lot quieter. And that's effectively what oversampling is. Instead of switching our whole project to a higher sample rate, we can just do that within the plugin itself. So in Saturn, we just turn on high quality. And you'll see now that those reflected harmonics, they just disappear. We can see here that in good mode, we've oversampled at a rate of 8x. So we're now effectively working at a sample rate of 352 kilohertz. So it's a lot higher than anyone would normally be running a project in. Even 4 times oversampling is more than enough in a lot of cases. So generally, you just want to turn that on anytime you're using saturation to prevent that aliasing. Having said that, there is a downside, which is that oversampling is going to add latency. So if you're doing anything in real time, if you're tracking with a plugin that is adding a lot of saturation, and it has oversampling turned on, you're going to get a lot of latency. So if you want to track with saturation, let's say you're recording a vocal and you actually want to hear how it sounds distorted so that you can kind of like change the level at which you sing or something like that, you want to be able to hear that saturation while you're recording. You just want to switch off oversampling. It means you're going to get some aliasing, but it's not a huge problem. Normally, if you're just doing kind of tonal stuff, so if we were down here on kind of like the second half of this, you can see we are getting this frequency here reflected back down, but it's going to be pretty quiet. It's only when we do really aggressive saturation that it becomes more of a problem. But if you just switch off oversampling while you're recording, and even then while you're mixing, if you're just doing it subtly, you might not even need to turn it on, and you're going to conserve some CPU in that case by turning it off. And if you do have options between 4x, 8x, etc., 4x is normally enough. If you're being really aggressive, then you might want to bump it up to 8x or higher. Now let's talk about the different types of saturation. And we have 4 main types: valve, tape, transistor, and transformer. So valve is pretty easy to remember. Most people are familiar with the idea of kind of valves and tubes from guitar amps, that kind of stuff. And a lot of hardware, for example, the LA2A, any derivatives of that tend to have a valve output gain stage, even though the actual compressor is light based. Then we also have equipment like thermionic culture. The culture vulture is a really popular saturation hardware that is valve based. Everything that thermionic culture do is valve based, and it tends to have quite a rich sound. But we're going to distill that down a little bit here in a second when we have a listen to this and look at what's actually happening. Why does it sound the way it sounds, rather than just kind of using these descriptors. And then we have tape, again, pretty self-explanatory. Unfortunately, I don't have a tape machine here. Otherwise, I would love to kind of do a hardware demo of that, but we'll put up a plugin. Pretty straightforward. It's the sound of tape. Then we have transformers, which are generally used in older hardware. So a lot of the older SSL stuff, like the 4KB, the early SSL desks, and a lot of the Neve stuff that people really like the sound of. That's because they're transformer based, which tends to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit dirtier and vibier. But again, we're going to break that down to why is that. And then lastly, we have transistors, and they're the cleanest of all of these, but if you drive them really hard, they're still going to sound pretty saturated. So a lot of the newer SSL stuff after, like the 9000 series and beyond is transistor based, because back then they were actually looking for things to be cleaner. We've kind of gone full circle where now generally we want to make things dirtier and more saturated, but historically, it's been a journey to move away from saturation, transformers, that kind of stuff, towards something really clean. And especially the SSL 9000, that started to become really popular with like hip hop and pop, where they wanted this kind of cleaner, super analog sound. And transistors were a really big part of that. So again, we'll pull up a plugin and do some kind of emulations of that. So first of all, let's have a listen to the vocal as it is.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
Okay, and now we're going to run it to the Audioscape Optocomp, which is effectively an LA2A. So this has a valve output stage. So if we really drive this gain, even if we're not adding any compression, we can hear what the tube saturation sounds like.
For speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
Now let's take a look at what this looks like on a graph. So here we can see just the EQ curve. So when we have this basically at a low gain level, it's pretty flat, but we've got a big boost down here in the low end, but it's below like 10 hertz, so it's probably not going to have an impact. And then we've got this peak up here towards 20K. So this is going to be audible. As we drive this gain more, it's probably going to become more pronounced. So we start to get this kind of scoop at around 12K, this big boost. So this is the thing to be aware of, is a lot of the time when we're applying saturation using different hardware models, different plugins, often they're also applying an EQ curve. So that's something that we'll continue to look at, and it's something to definitely be aware of as you're playing around with different saturation plugins, because a lot of the differences that you're hearing could be to that EQ, due to that EQ curve, rather than the actual saturation itself. Now, if we flick over to harmonic analysis, this is where we'll be able to see the overtones. So if we bring the gain all the way down, we can see 100 hertz here, which is our test tone, and pretty much nothing else. This is just kind of the noise floor. Then as we start to increase this, we can see something here at 300 hertz creeping up. So that's going to be a third order. We've also got 500 hertz, fifth order. So basically we're just adding a lot of odd order harmonics. Okay, so already that's interesting. This is a valve stage and we're mostly adding odd. What happens if we drive it a lot harder? Now we start to also introduce some even, a little bit quieter. So our odd here at 300 is still louder than our even at 200, but we've gone from only having odd order harmonics to also having some even order harmonics. And then if we drive it really hard, then we kind of get this quite gradual slope where it's just descending volume all the way with all intervals. So second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. So this is where we can start to move beyond these kind of vague descriptive words of tube sounds a certain way and tape sounds a certain way, and start to look at, okay, but why is that? And we can see here that with tube or valve, if we want to emulate that with open compressor, for example, at a low gain stage, then we probably just want to add odd harmonics. But if we want to emulate kind of the sound of a valve at like maybe a medium to high gain stage, we can add in a little bit of even harmonics, and if we want to crank it, we just add everything. But again, a big part of why this sounds the way it does could also be due to this curve. And if we like really crank this, you can see it starts to become pretty radical. Let's move on now to tape saturation. So for this, we're going to use the Arturia J37, which is a really nice plug-in emulation of the Studer J37. And we're just going to do what we've been doing this whole time. I'm going to leave the stock settings for now, and we're just going to increase the drive.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
We could then play around with these different colors.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline.
And you can hear a really big difference between all of those. And this will bring me to a point now that we'll dig into a lot more later. And that's that when it comes to saturation, you just have to try stuff out. A lot of these sound different based on the balance between the odd and even harmonics. But again, arguably, like we just saw with that, the EQ curves that they apply can have just as much or more of an impact to the overall quality of the saturation and the quality of the sound. So a lot of the time with saturation plugins, you just have to try a bunch of stuff and see what you like. So let's take a look under the hood now, because so far it doesn't particularly sound different to Valve in the sense that we can either distort it and crush it, or we can not. And there's degrees between that. But let's actually kind of distill this down to first principles and look at what's happening under the hood. So already here with the drive at 0, you can see we've got quite a radical EQ curve. We've got this boost here at 40 hertz. That's definitely going to be audible, versus on the Opto, it was much lower. We've then got this kind of like cut, boost, cut thing going on. So 40 and 100 are going to be more prominent with cuts kind of either side. Got a really kind of big bump in this kind of 5 to 700, 900 kind of range. So that's probably going to add some warmth, but that's a little bit high. It's going to probably feel more like presence or body. Or if we take a look at our EQ cheat sheet, so we can see here 500 to 1K. If there's too much, it's going to start to get kind of honky, nasally. But if we've got the sweet spot, it's going to sound quite full, but it's a little bit high to be warmth. By the way, if you want to grab a physical copy, we've got a bunch of different cheat sheets on a range of topics. You can go grab a physical or digital copy at mastering.com. Then we've got this big cut here in the upper mid-range. So that's definitely going to create, in combination with that boost in the kind of 500 to 1K range, cutting this is going to definitely feel like it smooths things out a little bit. And then this huge boost up here all the way up to kind of 15K. And that's with the drive at nothing. So really important to be aware of. If we then look at the harmonic analysis, So we're getting some noise floor where it's kind of emulating what any piece of hardware would do. Maybe this is like a small second order interval harmonic here. And as we increase the drive, yeah, we can start to see that come up. So even at the bottom drive, we're definitely getting like a second order harmonic. As we increase that, we're getting a lot more second. So already one takeaway from this, on the valve, initially we just had third order harmonics. On the tape, initially we just have second order harmonics. So valve is third or odd, tape is even or second order at low levels. As we start to increase it, we can see this third order also coming in quite aggressively. Yeah, we can see second, then third, then the fourth starts to come up. And if we switch between these different modes, slight variations in harmonics. So kind of like a volume shift. This one's more second than third. This one is just more in general. And that third kind of pops up even more. Here they're about level. And then here it's quite similar to that one. So again, they're just different types of tape that they're emulating. I imagine if we look at the EQ as well for each of these, so different curves for each of these as well, which is also going to have a big impact on the sound. Moving on now to transformers, let's listen to the SSL Fusion transformer. This is taken out of the SSL Fusion, which is a hardware unit where they've added in a transformer to kind of get that older, vibier sound, and this is a plug-in emulation of that. We've got some other controls here like shine, but we'll just ignore that for now. We're going to focus on our main control again, which is just going to be our amount in this case, which is the same as drive.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but
so if we want to get even more crunch out of this, we can also just boost our input trim here rather than adding a separate gain plugin to lift that level going into it.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but
so a lot more subtle. We can't quite push that to the same extent that we could the valve and the tape. Sounds really nice though. I don't use this plugin a ton, but that was pretty impressive. I think I'll be using that more. And then if we want to push it even harder, we can load up Saturn. This is a kind of all-round saturation tool that you can pretty much emulate anything. It also does multi-band saturation, which we're going to come back to later. But if we want, we can go to transformer and let's say gentle, and let's see how hard we can push this.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline.
And then we could even A/B this now with tape just to see how it's kind of sounds different. But again, a lot of it's going to be down to the EQ curve.
I was built for speed. I was built for speed. I was built for speed. I was built for speed.
It's a bit louder.
I was built for speed. I was built for speed.
So there's some volume differences there, but if you focus on the actual saturation, it's not that different, really.
I was built for speed. I was built for speed.
The character of the breakup. The biggest difference that I hear, the most noticeable thing, is just that we've got way more low end on the tape. But again, that's actually because of the EQ that's being applied, not the saturation. If we pull up Saturn in Plugin Doctor and go to Gentle Transformer, we can see there is an EQ curve, but it's very different, even to the tube one there that was kind of the default. Well, that's pretty flat. Tape's pretty flat. Warm tape is just boosting the low end, so that's a big part of why it's going to sound warm. If we go back to our gentle transformer and add drive, for some reason that's not showing in Plugin Doctor. So let's go to Logic and just do it on the EQ. So like we were doing earlier, now I just have a test sine going through at 100 Hertz. We're driving on the gentle transformer, and you can see as we bring that up, we're getting mostly odd, or interestingly, we get kind of initially this little second order creeping up with the third, and then the third starts to overtake. So again, another thing to notice is like, just with the previous two, it really does depend on what level you have it. The balance between like odd and even isn't this fixed thing. Normally it's dependent on where you set the drive. And it's not that you need to pull up every plugin you own and start to analyze this. It's just, for now, we're going to kind of get clear on this picture. So transformer, we start to get a lot more third, initially some second as well. If we compare that to the SSL, similar, we can reset shine, but pretty much we have third, so odd. Something creeps up there quickly. What's that, like 600, 700? So another odd harmonic, but then it's 5 that starts to really come up. And then 7 comes up with it, and then 9, etc. So to recap, valve, initially odd, but then a bit of both. Tape, initially even, but then a bit of both. And then transformer, so far what we're seeing is a lot more odd than anything else. But when we really pushed it with the Saturn, same thing. We started to get both in there, just at a much, much lower level. So pretty much just odd order for transformers. Finally, now we have transistor style saturation. So this is where we're going to pull up one of my favorite saturation plugins, probably my go-to, the one I use the most, which is Decapitator by Soundtoys. And if we go to the N mode, that's going to model a Neve preamp, specifically the 1057, which was transistor based. I'll come back to this later, but we've got some other modes here. This is why I love it. It's very flexible. But for now, let's just take a listen to this style.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
To compare to transformer.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gas. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gas. I was built for speed. You got a fire in.
Now let's compare it to tape.
I was built for speed. I was built for speed.
Definitely some tonal differences there. Let's pull it up in Plugin Doctor. We can see here in the N mode, even with pretty low drive, again, surprise, surprise, we have an EQ curve. Cutting the highs quite a lot, which is interesting. A bit of a boost down here, 28, so very low. And then this kind of broad boost around the mid-range. Again, around that kind of 500 hertz, but a little bit lower this time, below 500. So this probably is going to be perceived more as kind of warmth. And then in terms of the harmonics, as we add drive with the transistor, we get second predominantly. But a real kind of blend here, actually. So a lot more happening straight away. That second pops up, but very quickly, it's not just second, it's also fourth, it's also sixth. So with some of those other ones, we would just see the second come up on its own for a while before anything else came in. In this case, we're also getting a lot of the others. And then as we drive it even harder, that third coming in, some movement around here. And then when we drive it really hard, still predominantly second, but a lot of that third comes in. And interestingly, some of these higher ones kind of drop down or stay pretty consistent. And then we just start to get a lot more of that third. So I'm curious what you're thinking right now, having seen all of that. And you can also leave a comment below to let me know your thoughts. But I don't think a lot of people have done that exercise, actually looking under the hood. And there's two big takeaways that I have from this. One, as I've said many times, is the EQ curve that gets applied is actually going to be probably a bigger differentiator in why these different hardware units, different plugins sound different. And then the second thing is that we have these different kind of balances between odd and even harmonics, and that does account for a big difference in the sound. But at the end of the day, they're not that different. When we bring in more odd, more even, a lot of them were kind of similar where we had more odd or even initially, and there is going to be a difference between those sounds, and that's the main thing that we can actually distill the difference in the sound of the actual saturation down to. If we ignore the EQ, it's going to be that balance between the odd, the even, and also the level between the different multiples. So with some of those, we got just the third harmonic, and then with that transistor at the end, we got some really prominent kind of higher level harmonics out the gate. So that is what's happening under the hood. You don't need to go and analyze every plugin. I just want you to understand why these things sound different and what's actually happening, so that when you scroll through these and just try out different stuff, which is going to be your predominant mixing workflow, is just trying stuff out, having your go-tos, just flicking through stuff and seeing how they sound. At least now you know why they sound different. And if you want to try and emulate these different things like valves, tape, etc., you can kind of come back here and recap like, okay, is it predominantly odd or even? But again, I wouldn't worry about that too much. Instead of thinking, I want to do a tape on this specifically, so I need to do more of this and less of that, I would just play around with these different things and just see what works in the context of what you're trying to process, see what nudges it in the direction you want to take it, what helps you achieve your ultimate intent, how do these things sound different, how do they make you feel different when you apply them to the different sources. And for the most part, it's just a case of trial and error, seeing what sticks. At this point, we've covered a lot of the fundamentals. So what I want to do now is dive into some specific plugin recommendations, a free one and a paid one, and we'll go a little bit deeper into each of those and how they work. Then we're going to compare saturation to other tools like EQ, compression, clipping, etc. We're going to talk about console emulations, multiband saturation, serial saturation, parallel saturation, some common mistakes, and then finally mix breakdown. So stick with me. We've covered a lot of the important ground now, but we're going to dive deeper into all of this and continue to get clear on the actual application of saturation, as well as deepen our understanding of how it works. So the free plugin that I recommend for saturation, and I've been using this for such a long time now, probably over a decade, is the Softube saturation knob. They've made a recent improvement. I haven't used this recently in a while, and we've got some nice improvements here with input and output gain and metering. Then we've also got some different modes if we want to play around with settings and A/B them. But the core of the tool is here. We've just got our saturation knob, as the plugin name implies. Again, very straightforward, just a drive control. And then we've got saturation type. Keep high, neutral, keep low. So let's start by having a listen in neutral.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
So as you can see, we've got the full range of options available to us, from kind of subtle tonal shift all the way up to kind of creative distortion. Let's dial that back up and try flicking between these different saturation types.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
Great. So we just get a nice easy tonal shift, really simple, 3 options. We don't need all the variations between that. We just can decide, okay, do we want a bit more highs, a bit more lows, or just keep it neutral. Incredible plugin, super easy to use. We also now have these input and output gain different, so we can automatically gain match.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
Super handy. Great little plugin. Highly recommend you check it out. Even if you have amazing paid saturation plugins, it's just pretty much everything you need all in one place. We can have a quick look under the hood to see what's happening here. So with the plugin off, we don't have any EQ shift other than this low pass filter that's happening there, which could be part of the oversampling. Kind of strange. I'm not sure why that's there, but it's above 20K, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. As we start to bring in some saturation, we can start to see the tonal shift that happens. And that's interesting. So this bump that kind of moves from like 200 to 100. And then we start to get, at the high settings, actually a massive low end boost. And that's pretty crazy saturated. A little bit more transparent than maybe some of the other plugins. The main thing to just bear in mind with this is that we are getting like a low end cut, quite an aggressive low end cut. We'll come back to that later on when we talk about multiband saturation, because generally we don't want to saturate the low end anyway, or we're not going to be directly applying saturation to low end channels like the kick, the bass, 808, stuff like that, unless we're doing it for a lot of character on a bass guitar, like a rock bass guitar, for example, and then we probably would expect to kind of lose or at least break up a lot of that low end anyway. So that's interesting. And then if we look at harmonic analysis, again, just in neutral, you can see it's actually a pretty big spread. So quite different to a lot of the other ones we've looked at, where there was a very clear either kind of second or third order harmonic. This time we've just got kind of like a bit of everything. And as we move it around here, everything just kind of moves around. We don't particularly get more. Maybe we get more third order as we increase it, and more second as well. But then these kind of come down. So some movement there. And then as we start to really push it, just kind of everything comes up. So unique, and again, it's just one tool to exist in a toolkit, worth having even if you have all of these other plugins, because now after looking under the hood, something that I'll bear in mind with this is if I want a really kind of broad, thick, saturated sound where straight away we're getting second, third, all of the evens, all of the odds out of the gate, then this is what saturation knob does. If we switch to keep high, you can actually see that it's having an impact on the harmonics as well. So we're maybe adding a bit more saturation in general. But you can see this top end, these kind of higher intervals really coming up. And then when we do keep low, we're losing some of this thickness here. So it's not just tone, it's actually affecting the harmonic series as well. And then if we look at the EQ curve, naturally keep low, we've got a big boost down there at 50 Hertz. And that fixes the problem we had before where, okay, if we start adding saturation, we get this like big cut down here at 50, but also a boost at 190. Instead, we get a massive boost at 50. So that would be good if you did want to have a ton of low end in something while saturating it and then keep high. Interesting. By far the most transparent of all of these. So instead of boosting here at kind of 150, we just lose that boost. And this is kind of boosting at 150 and cutting up here, whereas this actually is just the most transparent of them all, but also lifts that top end. So it's kind of like a high shelf just here at 100 Hertz. And then as we get really aggressive, that curve starts to change a bit. And now this is the impact of the harmonics really kind of creating a radical EQ curve. But until we get to that heavy saturation, it's kind of like a high shelf or a low shelf 100 cut, depending on how you look at that. So really interesting, well worth getting. As for paid plugins, I've mentioned this already. My favorite, my go-to has been for a long time now is Decapitator. I really like these different models. You can see here in the manual, so A is a Ampex tape drive preamp. So we've got kind of an Ampex 350. E is a Chandler EMI TG channel. So this is early channels from like Abbey Road. This is actually transistor based, and the earlier kind of red Abbey Road stuff was all transformer, but again, generally there was kind of a movement towards transistor for more transparency, but we can still get a lot of drive out of it. Then we have the N for the Neve 1057. This is another transistor base that we heard earlier, but with a slightly different character. We then have T, which is one of the Thermonic Culture Vulture settings, and that's tube valve based, but this is our triode setting. And then we have our pentode setting, which is just different styles or different characters of tube or valve saturation. You can try and memorize what each of these do, but you can just basically flick through them. So I normally just increase the drive.
I was built for speed.
Flick through.
You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap.
And depending on the context or the track that I'm working on, the intent that I'm working towards, what problems need solving, if generally the whole mix needs brightening up, I'm probably going to choose a brighter saturation. On something like the lead vocals, I'm probably also going to go brighter so that it doesn't get buried in the mix. Other times though, maybe not. I might be going for a kind of warm, grungy vocal sound, and then I might go for darker. So it depends, but you can just flick around, try them out. A few things that I really like about the Decapitator, other than that kind of flexibility, having all those different styles. One is the auto output, never have to worry about that. We also have the punish mode if we want to really drive things. And then the tone is just a kind of very easy one knob adjuster.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gas.
Just makes it really easy to kind of get the tone that you want. Again, I would recommend starting with the different styles, choose the one that you like the most, and then you can kind of fine tune the tone and even add low cut, high cut, these different EQ curves, thump if you want to. And then finally, we've got a wet dry knob, which is really helpful for parallel saturation, which we're going to come back to later. Taking a look under the hood, our different styles have got different EQ curves. No surprise there. It's a big part of why they sound different. And then as we add more drive, we're probably just going to get more radical curves. Some of these are boosting the low end more than others. A is a little bit kind of more balanced. E is a really big scoop in the mid-range. N is a big low end boost. T, we kind of also get a bit of a smiley face, but with a kind of upper mid-range cut. And then P is actually quite similar. Triode, pentode, they're both valves, so more similar because they're just different variants of valve saturation. And then if we look at our harmonic analysis, we can see here that they're going to have slightly different profiles. So we go from A, which is predominantly even order, to E, where we start to get more of that third. N, even more third, a bit less of that fourth order. T, still lots of even, but a bit more odd. And then P, probably the most odd out of all of them. So interestingly, definitely leans more towards even order, which I didn't realize. So that's interesting to know. And again, another reason why generally with saturation, you want to have quite a lot of these because they all sound slightly different, all have different flavors to them. So there's some situations where decapitator might work and others where you might go straight to like the J37 for a slightly different sound, or the SSL Fusion, etc. The dark and bright, you can see here, actually does affect the harmonics as well. So as we make it brighter, we bring down that second order, bring up that third order, and these other higher orders, the fourth order. And then obviously in terms of the EQ curve, you can see that's going to have quite a big difference there as well. Even if we don't have any saturation, we can see here the tone control just kind of acts as like a tilt EQ. So we can either add more brightness or more darkness, or keep it in the middle. We then have our low cut or high pass, which is just going to high pass everything. It's not just a high pass on the saturation. Of course, what we can do is band pass the saturation itself, and then if we use the wet knob to blend in some of that original source, we can keep the full source material and then blend in our saturation with whatever low cut and high cut we have. So that's pretty straightforward. Then we've got these switches. Thump is a low end boost all the way down at 30-ish, 20, 30, but obviously with this curve, it's going to get some stuff higher than that as well. And then we have steep, which interestingly, if we have that off, so this must be the neutral, and then we bring that in, it actually cuts the high end, it seems like, more so. So with the off, we get this kind of upwards trajectory, and then when we turn it on, it's like we cut that high end a little bit. But it's pretty subtle actually, and it only affects stuff very high up at that kind of 20k area. Not super helpful, to be honest. I mean, that's why I've not really used it before. Let's see how audible that is.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this kind of love don't come cheap. I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline, but this...
Yeah, doesn't make a huge difference compared to thump.
I was built for speed. You got a fire in your gasoline.
Also not super noticeable on a vocal where there's not a lot of content down there anyway, but if you did that on a drum bus, for example, that's going to be pretty significant. So yeah, I definitely find that thump is a little bit more helpful. Steep, yeah, undecided on that. I'm not sure if it needs to be there. Something I want to dig into now is the difference between saturation and EQ. Because in many ways, we're achieving similar outcomes. We're changing the tone, especially if we're on that subtler end of the spectrum. If we get into kind of creative distortion, you just can't do that with EQ. But if we're using subtle saturation to kind of open things up, a lot of the time it will kind of make things sound a bit more three-dimensional and have this kind of smiley face EQ sound to it, where we're maybe like boosting the lows and the highs and like cutting the mids a little bit. Again, as you can see, a lot of that is actually because there is a literal EQ curve being applied. So while it's impossible to completely separate these things, we can think about the differences and when EQ might be more useful versus saturation now that we have an understanding of what's actually happening under the hood. The key thing to think about here is that when we use an EQ, we can only boost what's already there. So let's say we have a bass guitar that's struggling to cut through on iPhone speakers, and it plays an important role in the song. We don't want it buried like the bass might normally be. Instead, we really want it to cut through. If you just boost the top end, there's just not much content there to boost. Versus if we use saturation, we're not boosting what's already there. As you've seen, we're actually creating new harmonic content. We're adding that second, third order interval, which is all new information that wouldn't otherwise be there. So if we go and keep low, so we've added intervals that are actually going to help that cut through on iPhone speakers, because it's kind of like we copy and pasted all of the low end frequency information up higher into the frequency spectrum. So that's the main difference to be aware of in terms of what's happening. In terms of the application, it tends to be a bit of both. Again, it's difficult to separate all of these things. If we're talking about EQ, compression, saturation, especially in the hardware world, it tends to be all of the above. We might load up a specific compressor unit primarily to get the compression and the gain reduction component of that. But it's also going to saturate, because that's why we like the sound of a lot of hardware. It has saturation built in due to the components, and we can drive that more or less. But there's also going to be an EQ curve. So even though we're loading up in a compressor, we're actually applying EQ and saturation at the same time. Generally, the way I think about it is with EQ, we are enhancing what's already there, or we're problem solving. If there's a specific issue in the source material, there's a really annoying frequency, or there's too much mud, we're going to have to cut that out with EQ. We can't really do anything surgical like that with saturation. The closest thing to saturation, though, is kind of like top end boost. If we're just boosting the high end on an EQ, that's where we start to overlap a little bit more with, okay, could we just do that with saturation? And again, it tends to not be an either or situation. It tends to be both. So let's say we wanted to add a bit more top ends to this drum loop. We could just load up an EQ and boost that top end. But sometimes that can sound a little bit sterile, or it can start to get a little bit harsh, versus if we add some high-end information with saturation. We're bringing out that top end more, but we're also doing some other stuff. We're making it more energetic. We're adding to the depth, or if you really push it, it kind of starts to collapse and we get less depth. But again, it's not normally a trade-off between the two. You're probably going to be doing a little bit of both. And if you were mastering a track that came to you and it was just really dark, it needed a lot of top end, you're probably going to be adding saturation and EQ at the same time. And a lot of the stuff that is known for being nice for boosting the top end, like the massive passive, for example, we are applying an EQ curve that we can see here when we boost that. But normally there's some drive that's happening as well. And it's the combination of the two that has this real kind of sweetening effect. So just to summarize, normally you're going to be doing a little bit of both. You can't do problem solving with saturation. Instead, with saturation, we're going to be leaning more towards the kind of sweetening ends of the spectrum. and it just sounds different. We're adding new content, so that's great when there isn't any content to boost within EQ. But if you want to add a lot of air, for example, you could either do it with saturation, but it's also going to change the general character of the whole source material, not just the top end, but it's going to introduce those harmonics. But then we can also boost that with EQ, and when we do both, we kind of get this nice combination. We can also think about the overlap between saturation and compression, because this is something we haven't really spoken about yet. But when you saturate something, you're effectively just pushing it into the ceiling of the component. So if we saturate a transformer, it just means we're getting really close to the ceiling of that. Now that has the impact of introducing these harmonics, but it also means that certain transients are going to get effectively clipped. We'll talk about clipping a bit more in a second, but there is this kind of compression effect happens. There's a knee going into that, where the closer we are to that ceiling of the component, we're going to get some gain reduction. So in essence, saturation is also compression. So if we pull up a plugin like DR meter, this gives us dynamic range. And this section here I just played with no saturation. Our dynamic range is 15.9. So now let's add saturation, and we can be quite aggressive with it. We can see now that our dynamic range has decreased to 11.5. So we've reduced the dynamic range. If we really crush it, we can bring that all the way down to 7.5. So the impact of this is you want to basically just bear in mind that when you saturate stuff, you're also controlling the dynamic range. So a lot of the time, if you drive a vocal going into the desk, for example, as well as compressing it on the way in, that's why when you pull it into mix, something that has been recorded through outboard in a big studio already sounds mixed. It's already had quite a lot of control with the dynamic range, versus when you just record a vocal straight into a clean interface and you pull it up in the mix, it hasn't had any dynamic range control at all. And to get to the same point, you would need to saturate it, which is going to reduce the dynamic range, also compress it to reduce the dynamic range, emulate what happened in the tracking phase, and then you're probably going to compress it even more when you're mixing, and maybe saturate it even more when you're mixing. So just bear in mind that saturation is also going to help you control that dynamic range, and the more aggressive you are with it, the more gain reduction you're going to get. Just like a compressor, if we use subtler settings, we're just going to get a little bit of gain reduction. If we use more aggressive settings, we're going to get more gain reduction and more controlling of dynamics. And that leads quite nicely into the next comparison I want to make here, which is saturation versus clipping. And clipping here, I'm going to focus specifically on hard clipping, because when we're talking about soft clipping, that's where the lines get even more blurred. And soft clipping is basically saturation, it's basically compression, it's clipping with a knee, where we don't just kind of clip at a hard ceiling. But hard clipping, effectively what we're doing is just cutting off the transients. So again, I'm going to pull up the cheat sheet binder here. So here at the top, we can see a waveform. Then we have the limited version, where the waveform never goes above the set threshold. So that's a limiter. We're saying don't go above this level. A clipper is very similar, but instead of turning it down, we actually cut off the peaks. And that's what turns it from a sine wave into a square wave. And square waves sound distorted. They have odd and even harmonics. So we're effectively saturating it, and I'll come back to that in a second. Effectively, the way to think about saturation versus clipping is that clipping is saturation. It's the same thing under the hood, but instead of using a drive control to clip the entire signal, with clipping, we're setting a threshold. So we're saying, okay, if our clipper is at -10, if it goes above -10, saturate it so much that it never actually goes beyond that. But if it's at -8, don't apply any saturation. So think of it as the same thing, just with a different control. Saturation plugins have a drive control, clipping has a threshold control. If we pull up Open Compressor 2, it has this delta solo function, and that means we can listen to only what's being added or taken away. It's the difference between the input and the output. And that means we can hear just the saturation, for example, or even, but we can also listen to the clipper. So if we dial in our clipper so that we're just catching some of these louder peaks, turn off saturation. First of all, you can hear how quick it is because we're just clipping single samples. It's these kind of very fast moments. If we pull this down all the way, you can hear it's just saturation, and we can actually see this reflected on the graph. It's all third order harmonics. So it's doing the same thing, it's just the way we use the tool is a little bit different. Normally we're using a clipper as a dynamic range control. We're saying don't go above this level, and we'd normally do it quite subtly, so we just catch those loud peaks, those kind of single samples that we heard before, and you would do that before your limiter in a mastering context so that your limiter doesn't have to work as hard. But if you want to, you can use a clipper as a saturation tool, again just with a different control, and it means that the louder the source material, the more saturated it gets. So it's kind of like a variable saturation. We're not just driving it across the board. We're saying only drive it above a certain level. So we could enable our delta solo and just not something we would probably do on a track like that, but maybe on a rock track we could be a little bit more aggressive with our clipper if we wanted to. And what we gain from that is more headroom, we control the dynamic range, we turn down those really loud parts, which means we can bring the whole thing up. And on a lot of rock music where we might not mind some distortion on the low end, on the kick, that kind of stuff, we can be a bit more aggressive with our clipping if we want to get even louder. So you can see here we're getting close to 3 dB. That's probably around 2 dB of gain reduction. So then we could add 2 dB. And it has a noticeable distorted sound, but I just wanted to show you that it is distortion. It's basically the same thing. It is saturation. It's just the way we control it is different. So again, just something to be aware of. Once you understand that underlying concept, you can be a little bit more careful with how you use clippers as well, because if you're using a clipper on a hip hop or a pop track where you want a really clean low end and you don't want to dull the transient too much, a clipper is probably not the thing to reach for because you're just going to distort it. Versus a rock track, you might not mind having a little bit of distortion if it helps you lift the overall volume. And it can also give a kind of more aggressive sound to it. If we combine that with some saturation, we can start to break it up even more. That changes the feel of it a lot. And again, notice the overlap. We're using clipping, but it's actually saturation. We're using saturation, but it's also kind of compressing and clipping at the same time as EQ. It's just all of the above. We're just focusing on different things or approaching these processes through different roads to achieve, in often cases, similar outcomes, but through very different techniques. If we're using a compressor versus a saturator, some of the outcomes are going to be similar, but the way we're creating those outcomes and the way we're thinking about those tools and the way we're controlling those tools is quite different. But at the end of the day, it's all kind of the same thing. So far, we've mostly focused on saturation when it comes to production, mixing, mastering, but what about recording? And that's a big part of why people like to record through certain consoles, through certain preamps, is because they have saturation built in. This SSL channel strip has got a preamp with a distortion control called VHD. That's going to sound different to, say, a Neve 1073. And again, all of these things you could break down to their kind of underlying principles, what balance of odd versus even and what kind of EQ curve is being applied on the way in. But a lot of the time when we're recording through nice preamps or recording through a desk or anything in a studio, there is going to be saturation applied on the way in. Now you can emulate that in the DAW using console emulations, and some of these are really popular. For example, we have the Slate Digital range of console emulations. And there's kind of two flavors to this. We have our virtual channel, which we would put on individual channels. And then we also have our virtual kind of mix bus that we put on the end. And again, this is just another variation of saturation and EQ, just using a slightly different context. So here we've still got input output, we've still got drive. We've got this extra feature here, which is groups, if you want to control multiple of these at the same time. So you could put this on every single channel in your DAW as if you recorded through these channels on the way in, or mixed through these channels on a mixing desk. And then interestingly, look, we have different modes. What does this remind you of? E mode, G mode, USA, Brit, N, Tube. Basically a decapitator, just with slightly different models and a slightly different context. But when you look under the hood, it's the exact same thing. There's nothing special about using a virtual channel on every single channel of your DAW compared to, say, just loading up Decapitator on every single channel of your DAW. They're doing the same thing under the hood. They've just been designed for slightly different purposes. Big part of this is marketing as well. They can market this as something that is different. Oh, this is a virtual channel that recreates the sound of, a 4K E desk. Versus, they might advertise their kind of all-round saturator as being slightly different. And there will be differences between those tools in terms of the EQ curve, the balance between odd and even, etc. But fundamentally, they're all the same thing. Having said that, it's still an interesting and useful technique. If you want to try and recreate a kind of analog studio in your DAW, you can just load up a virtual channel on every single channel, load up the virtual mix bus on your mix bus. On top of that, add, say, the J37 as if you're going through tape, all of these different emulations that are recreating analog hardware. Over time, those little additions of harmonics in lots of different places are going to add up to something quite significant. But again, you just need to be aware of the EQ impact of that, because I've seen tricks where people use these on like their subgroups and that kind of stuff, thinking that it's just doing console emulation, but actually a big part of it is that there might be a big scooped EQ curve. So when you load this up on a source and you notice it sounds really different, if that's pleasing and you like it, great. Just be aware that it's probably adding like a massive EQ curve under the hood. At this point, it feels inconsistent to not at least pull up the virtual channel in Plugin Doctor, and we can see here, as we add some drive, relatively flat, but we've got some different EQ curves going on here, and then harmonic analysis. You can see, this is just adding even order harmonics. The different modes are slightly different. So under the hood, it's a saturation tool, just with slightly different name and face to it, and a slightly different purpose, where the idea is you might just add this to every single channel. If you like the way that this sounds, if you like the virtual channel and the kind of profile, the EQ and saturation profile that has, awesome. Use that as your saturator effectively. Okay, quick outfit change. Just kidding, it's another day. Now let's talk about 3 variations of saturation. We're going to talk about multiband saturation, parallel saturation, and serial saturation. So multiband saturation is pretty straightforward. It's when we saturate just a certain part of the frequency spectrum. So for example, classic trick with this, bass, if it's not really cutting through on small speakers, we could add a crossover here using Saturn, which is a really handy multiband saturation tool. And then we can actually turn down the saturation so it's completely off on everything below, say this is set to 500 hertz. We could even probably go a bit lower than that. And then we can just solo the low end to kind of perfect that crossover. So we just want to keep that nice round low end really clean, because if we start saturating that, on a bass guitar, it kind of works, but if you're working with anything that's super clean, like an 808 or a sine wave, something like that, it's going to be very noticeable. So we can turn off the drive here and instead just drive the top end, and we can solo that if we want as well. You can even distort it quite aggressively. Because we're adding a bunch of new harmonic content, but only above a certain point, that's going to add high frequency content that's going to cut through a lot more on small speakers, for example. Now, there are lots of other applications for multiband saturation. If you ever find yourself thinking, oh, I wish I could just saturate the mid-range or saturate the top end, that's another common technique. Some people call that an exciter, just saturating the top end while leaving the mid-range clean. As with most things, I would just wait until you have a specific reason why you want to do that. There's a problem you need to solve, or you just want to add top end or something like that without affecting the rest of the sound. That's when you would reach for a multiband saturation. And there's one more tool for this that's really handy called Spectre. This is a lot less aggressive than Saturn. With Saturn, we're kind of splitting up the signal into multiple bands. But with Spectre, when you boost and saturate a certain frequency, it's effectively just saturating the delta signal. So it's as if we boosted 3K and then saturated just the 3K signal. And what that means is it's a little bit less aggressive. It's kind of like it's doing it in parallel, which we're going to talk about in a second. And we can compare here. So if we do a boost here of, say, 8 kilohertz by about 5 dB, and then we could try and replicate that here, 8 kilohertz, and we'll try and match these a little bit. So this is Spectre. Maybe a bit lower. So that's about 3K and above. And we can compare then to Saturn. So it's a very different sound. We would probably want to use some kind of subtler saturation to compare, something like this maybe. So they sound quite different. There is some kind of EQ going on with Spectre as well, because we're adding a delta signal. So we're creating a difference between the input and the output. That's the delta. But we're just saturating it. But you can clearly hear as well that it is kind of boosting that content too. And then we have some different modes. Tape, tube. So a cool plugin, definitely worth checking out. Technically not multi-band saturation, it's its own kind of thing, but they sound different, they have different applications, worth having both. That leads on nicely to parallel saturation. So on something like vocals, this can be really handy. You could also do it on an entire mix. I've definitely done that before, do it quite often in mastering. And it's effectively where we would duplicate the source material to create a new version. So let's say we've got version A, we create version B that's a lot quieter. We just saturate version B and then we kind of tuck it in underneath. And you could do that by creating a bus or literally duplicating the channel. In reality, most saturation tools have a blend control. So that's effectively what you're achieving when you use the dry, wet or blend mix. So if we create a really saturated version,
so I love the weekdays instead. Hungry, when will I eventually come to stand and break? I'm made to be living that way.
And then we've got the dry.
So I love the weekdays instead.
And we can blend in the wet underneath.
So I love the weekdays instead. Hungry, when will I eventually come to stand and break? I'm made to.
Works really well for adding top end to vocals. Very common technique. And also works really well on full mixes. So let's load up Saturn, but this time on an entire mix. And we can compare, if we go to warm tape, we could have just a subtle amount. Or if we switch to our B mode, we could add a lot. And maybe even brighten it up a bit. And then tuck it underneath with our mix knob here. Then let's compare subtle saturation versus aggressive saturation in parallel, tucked underneath. They sound different. Neither is right or wrong. We're just doing a different thing. So in certain situations, you might prefer one approach over the other. Then the final variation to talk about is serial saturation. So this would be effectively adding multiple saturation plugins in serial, one after the other, instead of being more aggressive with one. So let's say we want quite a distorted sound. We could do a little bit with Saturn, and then we could stack Decapitator on top of it, for example. So we could have multiple instances in the same signal chain, something like that. So first saturation on Saturn, and then we could also bring in Decapitator. We could even put this in parallel. And in reality, serial saturation happens quite naturally. If you're saturating on the way in when you're recording, then saturating on individual channels when you're mixing, also saturating on buses, also saturating on the mix bus, also saturating during the mastering. That's also serial saturation in a sense. We're stacking it up in multiple places. But if you want to, you can literally do it kind of next to each other like that. Again, it's just a different way of approaching it. You're going to get a slightly different tone from maybe combining multiple saturation plugins. Or if you want to get quite aggressive saturation, but when you do a lot with one, it's maybe too much. You could see if you can kind of nudge it up gradually using multiple. But for the most part, probably not going to do that. It's just going to be that you're saturating at different stages in the signal flow, and that's where serial saturation mostly comes into play. I want to cover 3 common mistakes now, and then we'll also address some frequently asked questions. The first mistake I want to talk about is saturating low end. And we've talked about the solution to this already, but quite often, especially if you're working with something that's got a big kick drum, anything modern, pop, hip hop, EDM, where we want that really clean low end, any form of saturation is going to affect the kind of consistency of that low end and start to break it up, so we don't have this kind of clean sine wave sound to the subs and the 808. But also it's going to really dull the transients. So if we use this track here, for example, which has got quite a punchy kick drum, you can hear how adding saturation starts to kind of muddy it up a little bit, and it starts to break up. Of course, we could be even more aggressive with that. Everything starts to get a little bit smeared. This is another good example. Let's have a listen to this. So this is without.
Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears rabble down through my bloodstream. Got me breaking down to bone and dust. Just fear for a change. Feel for my body. Friday was an empty pot. Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears rabble down through my bloodstream.
And this is where you want to be careful, and we'll talk about oversaturation in a second, because sometimes when you're adding tape or these things that you might have in your mastering flow, even if they're really subtle, or sometimes plugins have some saturation in there and you don't even realize it, then it is going to start to break up that low end. But also focus on the transient, because we're getting this kind of smearing effect across the board, both in terms of the frequency content and the consistency or the cleanliness of that low end, but also the transient itself is getting quite subdued.
Gotta feel now to mess it up.
And I can use a transient enhancer to make this even more apparent. If we bring out that kick transient a little bit more, which in a lot of hip hop, pop, it's really important to have like these kind of punchy transients.
Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through my bloodstream. Got me breaking down to bone and dust. Fear for a change, view for my body. Friday wasn't it? Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears.
That's where we're getting the kind of the beater of the kick drum rather than here.
Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through my bloodstream.
And then listen as we start to saturate that, how the transient doesn't jump out at you as much.
Gotta feel now to mess it up.
Even just turning it on is enough to start to smear that.
Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through my bloodstream. Got me breaking down to bone and dust. Use fear for a change. Gotta feel now to mess it up. Holy tears ramble down through.
We get this kind of warmer, rounder low end, which would be appropriate for some genres, maybe rock. But for this, it's very different. Stylistically, it's not what you would expect. This also applies to clipping, and that's why I generally use clipping a lot more on like rock music, guitar-based music where we might expect a lot of distortion, and not on something that you want super clean like hip-hop, pop, EDM, because clipping, as we've discussed, is basically a form of distortion. So even in the mastering process, where it might be quite typical to use clipping going into a limiter, I avoid clipping altogether if I'm working with something that's really clean and really transient heavy, or the transients are important and we want that kind of clean, deep sound. Clipping is kind of counterintuitive to that. The second mistake is unintentional oversaturation. So I think a lot of people, when they learn about saturation, you're watching this video, you want to go and try it, and you start using it in a bunch of different places, and very quickly you can overdo it. It's kind of like over seasoning your food and everything sounds really distorted. In reality, most applications are going to be extremely subtle. We're going to be focusing more on that subtle tonal shift and that kind of creative distortion. And then if you are going to be intentional and be a lot more aggressive, that's fine if you're going into that with clarity of, actually, this track I want to sound like McG, or I want to sound like something modern where it's really saturated, or I want it to sound like something really old that was recording on an old Neve desk, and I want this kind of heavy saturated sound. That's fine. If it's intentional, it's an intentional production decision. What you want to avoid is just using too much saturation when you're mixing and kind of ending up in a similar place as if it was a creative production decision, but actually you weren't looking to do that. So if you are just looking for kind of subtle, like, I just want to, give this a little bit of a tonal shift, like make it a bit deeper, more three-dimensional, probably need a lot less than you would expect. And a good technique to avoid oversaturating is kind of bring it up until you notice it and then back it off, and then you haven't gone too far. So that's very noticeable. That's where it starts breaking up, and we probably want to back off quite a bit from there. And then when we do our bypass comparison, our kind of before after, you want it to be subtle. We should also volume match that. A little bit louder now, get on the way out. -2. And again, we're getting a lot of smearing in that low end. That kick drum, really nice and punchy. We're starting to lose a bit of that. So again, we could do this and instead do the same approach here, where we're going to saturate until we can hear it, just ignoring the low end now to keep that kick intact, and then back it off. And now we can be a bit more aggressive. still want to be careful there. So you want to feel it more than you hear it when you're going for that subtle effect. And a common mistake is not doing that, just going to the point where everything is kind of oversaturated in a way that's unintentional. And then the third and final mistake that I want to cover here is not using, or at least not experimenting with different saturation plugins, because they all sound quite different, as you've kind of learned here in the video, for various reasons, different combinations of odd and even harmonics, or second versus fourth and sixth, and how it kind of scales down within those odd and even harmonics, and then all of the different EQ curves that come attached to them. They all sound quite different. So you want to think of it as kind of a toolkit of these different sounds, very similar to reverb in that sense, where different reverbs just kind of sound different. And then anytime you want saturation, you can just kind of scroll through and just try some different stuff. So if I'm working on a track and I think, actually, I want this guitar to be a lot dirtier, I'll load up Saturn, I'll load up Decapitator, I'll load up Open Compressor. I'll try out a bunch of different plugins. And while I do have my go-tos that I'm probably more likely to start with, like Decapitator, I will often try out several and also use several in different places across the mix to try and create a little bit more differentiation. Or let's say you've got some stereo guitars, hard left, hard right. You could use one saturator on the left and a different one on the right, and that will kind of enhance the width a little bit more because they'll sound a bit different. So you want to have a few tools available to you, and ideally get to know them and then experiment with them quite a lot, so that we're starting out trying different plugins, and then even within the plugins we can then try out the different modes. And if we have 5+ different modes in each plugin and a few plugins, then we've already got kind of like 15 different saturation profiles that we could work with. Okay, now for some FAQs, and these are taken straight from our members community. I posted that I was making this course, and we've got some questions here that we're going to run through and answer. How to make Brain create the low end even if there is no audible signal below 50 Hertz. So this isn't going to be a classic case of saturation. There's a couple of ways to approach this. One is something like Waves R bass, which is actually creating overtones and harmonics that trick your brain into thinking there's a signal lower down, but it's not actually generating anything there. It's really interesting. So for example, if we go to this drum loop, and I just solo this section. Now with an EQ, we could boost that low end. But we're only boosting what's already there. So if you have a kick drum that is a sample that's just maybe lacking some body and weight, you can use something like Waves R bass to introduce But what's interesting, I've never actually looked at this on a spectrum analyzer. From reading the manual and just generally speaking to people about this, even though it sounds like it's creating that frequency, it really sounds like it. Apparently it's not. So, for example, if we look at the spectrum analyzer before, okay, we can kind of see what's going on at 40. Helpfully, it's actually just very much at 0. We bring in our bass. Hold on. It says here, the brain, however, can reconstruct a missing fundamental from just the harmonics the ear is hearing. Your ear hears these harmonics and your brain can then go backwards to recreate the fundamental. You hear the low bass note, even though the speaker is not capable of reproducing it. You can also use Renaissance bass to tune the low end of a room. If, for example, you are the front of house in a venue with the bottom end that is muddy or inarticulate, you may be able to strip the signal of some of the low end frequencies that are causing the mess and then introduce higher harmonics that the room can handle. So that's what the manual says, but it's very clearly actually adding some content around the frequency that we set. So let's get a little bit more granular with this. What happens if we generate, say, a 500 Hertz signal, and then we add our bass at 50 Hertz? So if we bring it all the way up to 238, we can actually see that we've got like a second order harmonic here, 1K. That's twice 500 hertz. We've also got something at 3K. So we're getting even and odd order harmonics. We're also getting something at 1.5, which would be 3 times 500. So that's an odd order interval. If we bring this down, we just kind of lose those. Let's actually see what this sounds like. Okay, what if it's 100 hertz? For the most part, it just seems to be adding volume. And if the frequency is high, it just kind of saturates everything. If the frequency is low, it's just boosting it. So let's go back to the manual. What does that frequency control actually do? Controls the frequency from which a Renaissance bass begins generating harmonic. Frequencies below this value will be removed from the signal and replaced with generated harmonics. The original bass frequencies can be mixed with the generated harmonics using the original bass in, bass out switch. So we've got our original bass, which is on the in. So we can see it there. If we turn off the original bass, we do get something still, even at no intensity. As we increase this, let's see what that sounds like. So if we disable this in, we're only hearing the generated content. When we have this set high, it's only generating content above 256. When we set it low, it is generating content down there, but also with overtones. So I think it's, if I'm understanding it correctly, the wording isn't great because it's saying frequencies below this value will be removed from the signal. That's pretty accurate. But then it also says that it's not actually creating a fundamental. You hear the low bass note even through this. You can use Renaissance bass to tune the low end of a room. So that only applies if we set it really high. So in this case, it is like we're creating the overtones as if there's low end without low end. But as soon as you bring this frequency down, we are actually generating low frequency content as well. So when we put this on a drum kit, we're not actually generating anything below. So that's the important distinction to make. We're not generating new frequency content. Depending on whether you have this in control set on or not, and depending on what you set this frequency to, you're introducing new overtones above the bass content. If you set the frequency really high, then you don't actually introduce any new bass, and that's where you can kind of trick the brain into thinking there's some low end frequency content there. If we set this high and disable the original, but it's not like suddenly it sounds like there's 50 hertz, even though there's not 50 hertz. Normally though, if you leave original bass on and you have this anywhere below, like 100, you're also just boosting the low end a ton. It's not that different to just boosting it with an EQ, except you are also getting some overtones above it. So it's kind of like a combined EQ saturator. Having said all of that, there are plugins out there that do generate new subharmonic content. There's the SSL Subgen, which is a synthesizer. It's actually introducing new content below whatever the lowest frequency in the source material is. Also in the mix, shout out to Michael, they just released a plugin called Bassmaker. I haven't tried this yet, but I understand it does a similar thing to Subgen, just in a slightly different way and maybe with some additional controls. So full circle back to the original question, how to make brain create the low end even if there is no audible signal below 50 hertz. In theory, our bass can do this, but for the most part, it seems like it's just boosting what's already there. I don't feel like it's tricking my brain into thinking there's 50 hertz when there's not 50 hertz, but that's the theory. And then if you want to actually create low end that's not there, not just trick the brain or make the brain, but actually introduce new subharmonic content, then you can check out Subgen or Bassmaker. And these tools aren't saturation, to be clear. Our bass is kind of like a saturation, and then we're also like boosting certain frequencies. Whereas these ones, they're not saturation, they're synthesis. They're actually introducing new harmonic content, probably using sine waves. I have a hard time remembering what types of saturation are symmetric/asymmetric and when to use which one adds odd/even harmonics. One easy way to know this, if you are an open compressor user, is you can actually see this in the oscilloscope. So when we add odd harmonics, you can see there's a pretty symmetrical shape to the wave. When we add even harmonics, you can see how it's kind of asymmetrical. So symmetrical is odd, asymmetrical is even. And you don't really have to know this. Again, this is kind of getting a little bit into the math, the technical stuff behind it. For the most part, you just need to know how it sounds and what applications to use different ones, which we've covered in this course. The reason why this is the case, if you imagine a sine wave, when we introduce second order harmonics, what you actually end up doing is flipping part of the sine wave over to the top half, like this. And that's what kind of doubles the speed of the wave. It's asymmetrical, but now we've got kind of like a faster wave because it's reaching quicker cycles. And this is what creates the second order. It creates a 2x interval. So you can kind of think of it as, even we're like speeding it up, and that's what makes it 2x, and then 2x is even and asymmetrical, versus when we have symmetrical, we're just adding kind of new waves like this, and this symmetrical process is not kind of speeding up the waveform in any way. We're not flipping anything over to the other side or anything like that. So this means we're kind of maintaining that symmetry, and because of that we maintain our original fundamental, which is 1x, and the multiples of that being odd. So that's one way to think of it. This isn't something I'm really deeply knowledgeable about without getting into mathematics, because this is kind of broader mathematics now beyond just mixing, mastering, or general kind of audio DSP. But for the most part, if you want to just remember, again, you can look at open compressor, or you can just remember it that symmetrical creates odd order harmonics and asymmetrical creates even order harmonics. You can remember it like this because of the way it manipulates the shape of the wave. Or you could think of it using some kind of mnemonic or kind of memory device. For example, not many things in the natural world are like fully symmetrical. So it would be kind of odd to get something that's purely symmetrical. Odd, symmetrical, whereas asymmetry is very normal. It's even, it's not odd. I don't know, one way to remember it. Again, it doesn't really matter day to day. What matters more is you know how they sound and you experiment with different plugins, just try stuff out, see what fits the context of what you're working with. Is there a point at which distortion crosses over into saturation, or is saturation just a nice word for distortion that enhances? Yeah, I think it's just all the same stuff. Saturation, overdrive, distortion, these are just different words for saturation. Distortion you generally tend to associate with more aggressive kind of creative applications, a distorted guitar where we're driving things quite hard, versus saturation, which I think people often associate with maybe just kind of subtle saturation that you might get from certain hardware pieces. And then overdrive is just something else, again, where we might expect it to be a bit more aggressive. But other than that, it's all referring to the same thing, which is just introducing new harmonic content at odd or even intervals. How can you use saturation to glue vocals together? So I'm going to assume this is referring to like backing vocals or groups of vocals. And to glue them together, pretty much anything, if we're talking about using compression to glue things together, or we're talking about saturation to use things to glue together, or other processes, the main thing that creates that glue is just processing things together as a unit. So when we add compression to a drum bus versus individually compressing the snare and the kick, or when we add compression to an entire mix versus individually compressing the elements, we're giving things the same treatment. We're applying processing that's reacting to the whole. And when the kick comes up, it's actually, ducking everything in the case of compression. Or with saturation, we're literally adding overtones to everything at the same time. So depending on the process, the actual kind of science under the hood of what's happening is going to be a little bit different. But just a way to think about it is, okay, anytime I'm processing lots of things together, even with EQ, it's going to have somewhat of a kind of homogenizing effect. So if you want to glue vocals together with saturation, I don't think it's more complicated than just putting them on a bus and adding saturation to the bus. And then normally when we think about glue, I would probably more likely associate that with compression, because again, we're kind of giving everything the same dynamic treatment and kind of treating it all as one. So normally some saturation combined with some kind of global or group compression is what's going to help glue things together a little bit more. Quick side note when it comes to compression, and again, that word glue, that's where I tend to think of maybe slightly slower release times and maybe like a feedback style compressor. When we have something really snappy, like fast attack and fast release, again, if we're kind of treating everything together, it can still kind of like glue them together by treating them all as one. But I think generally when people think about glue, adding glue to a mix, for example, normally they're referring to like slower forms of compression, or like a tube compressor is like really gluey because we're doing it all at once. We're adding saturation, especially if we're using like a tube hardware compressor, and tube compressors also tend to be kind of slower release, feedback topology, that kind of stuff. And that to me has this kind of gluey, or sometimes I even say gooey, smooth sound to it that I think is also another thing that people associate with this concept of glue. My biggest question is usually just when to switch from cleaning to dirtying a sound. Half of our job is to remove dirt and the other half is to apply it, and it's a bit of a head scratcher. So this is like two conflicting ideologies. I think that's what you're getting at here. And in some cases, you might feel like you should clean things up. For example, if you're recording and there's something that's noisy, or you're boosting the preamp quite a lot on a dynamic mic and you're getting some noise floor because of that, or whatever it might be. And then there might be kind of like objectively bad forms of noise, like if you're recording a vocal take and a car drives past. Some people could say that can add character, but we could say that anything's like undesired or anything that's unintentional is kind of bad noise. But in terms of cleaning things up, I think that's where it's more about getting clear on like what's the ideology, and what's the ideology for this specific track. What's the intent for this specific track? Do I want everything to be really clean? If it's like a modern hip hop or pop track where I just want like really clean transients and really clean low end, then you're probably not going to be adding saturation, and you're going to try and keep things cleaner during the recording process. You're probably going to use a cleaner preamp, that kind of stuff. Versus, a rock track that you want to sound like really dirty, you're probably going to be dirtying it up. So if you're finding yourself kind of conflicting between these two ideas within the same project, then that probably just means you're not approaching it from a place that's very intentional, and instead you're just letting people impress their ideas on you. Some people saying clean things up, some people are saying dirty it, but really they are conflicting ideologies, and you should decide, okay, for this track specifically, for the intent that I have, the emotion I want to create, the way I want it to sound, do I want to keep things really clean or really dirty? And it probably doesn't make much sense to combine the two. For me in general, I'm not confident in saturation. Which type is best for vocals? Which one for sounds with high frequency? Should EQ be before saturation? If we add saturation after EQ, it generates what we just cut with EQ. When do we use tape saturation? When diode saturation? Lots of confusion, to name a few. So as we've kind of dived into in this course, under the hood, they're all doing a very similar thing. All saturation tools are adding some combination of odd and even harmonics with kind of different slopes to, you know, how loud the fourth harmonic is compared to the second harmonic, that kind of stuff. And different tools also have their own kind of built-in EQ curves. It's not just saturation. So there is really no kind of hard and fast rule. It is just a case of trying stuff out. There are some rules of thumb maybe. So tape does tend to be used a bit more on your mix bus, whereas on a vocal you might be leaning more on kind of like preamp saturation, and that might mean more like transformer based. Or if you're using a tube saturation, again, that normally would be on like the mix as well, but also individual channels. So there are no rules other than maybe some like tendencies that people have, but for the most part you can just approach it from a place of experimentation. Just have some go-to tools anytime you want to kind of saturate things a little bit. Try different stuff out, see what works in the context of the mix, try different tools, and then within those tools try different kind of settings. And you don't really have to know what's happening under the hood. It's good to understand it, but in terms of like practical application, it's just a case of like trying stuff out and seeing what works in that context. So I wouldn't say that there is a best type for vocal. I wouldn't say that there is a best type for content with high frequencies. It's just about trying stuff out and having a toolkit of tools at your disposal, and maybe understanding how those tools sound different, and then you'll be able to match them to different contexts. As for EQing before or after saturation, again, there's no right or wrong answer. They're just going to sound slightly different. It's not something that I think about a ton. Normally, it will just come down to your workflow or whatever you notice first. If you're mastering a track, for example, it might be typical to kind of apply corrective EQ first, get it to a good point, and then maybe you'll saturate later. And if you're boosting the high end, that could be before or after saturation. Again, it's something you can just experiment with and just be aware of. But for the most part, I don't think it's something that you need to kind of overthink. Just be aware that if you boost and then saturate, you're going to be saturating the content you just boosted, versus if you saturate and then boost, sometimes adding the saturation negates the need for the boost because you've introduced that higher frequency content. So then you might not feel you need to boost it as much. And then again, consider that there's a lot of tools, especially analog modeling EQs, that do both at the same time. They are saturating and boosting. So you really can't decouple these things fully. And I wouldn't worry about it too much because there is no hard and fast rule. And even if you said, I always want to EQ before saturation, certain hardware pieces wouldn't let you do that, depending on kind of the signal flow through the hardware piece. So generally just don't worry about it. It's just something to be aware of. And there might be the odd situation where you're like, actually, no, I want to saturate this first to see if I can get it sounding brighter so that I don't have to boost it. That might just sound different. But yeah, there's no kind of hard and fast rules. I have a bunch of questions referring to saturation. What are the differences between adding saturation and adding harmonics? Same thing. Saturation is just introducing new harmonics at odd and even intervals. Just different tools will do that to different extents with different kind of shapes to them. Using tape saturation while mixing in the box seems really odd. What are the best modern saturation plugins and why? So tape saturation under the hood, it's just introducing predominantly second order harmonics, and different tape modeling plugins have that. But it is a lot of marketing stuff. You can distill it down to just odd harmonics and even harmonics, but there is some variability within that. Even if you say odd harmonics, it's okay, well, how loud is the third harmonic compared to the fifth harmonic? Also, a lot of these tape plugins will have their own EQ built in that are kind of designed to model how a tape machine might have sounded. So a lot of them are really good. I wouldn't say it's odd. Yeah, it would be better if you could use a real tape machine, but these plugins are designed to emulate the sound of tape without all of the hassle. So that's absolutely fine. In terms of the best modern saturation plugins and why, I like the Kramer tape from Waves, the J37 from Arturia for tape stuff, and then for just general distortion, Decapitator or Open Compressor, which has odd and even on separate dials, so you can really kind of perfect it yourself from a base level. Where is the best place in the chain to insert saturation? I generally just go towards the end. I tend to think first about problem solving, which might be like dynamic processing to get something just kind of more in line, and then maybe some corrective EQ, some like broader EQ if I want to shape things tonally, and then I tend to add saturation towards the end. And then after that would be like limiting and clipping. So you can kind of think of it as roughly kind of like, some EQ, some compression, then saturation and clipping, and then kind of limiting last, whether you're mastering or even if you're limiting buses, that kind of stuff. You would want that after saturation, but otherwise I tend to have it quite far towards the end of the chain. Does it make any difference where you place it in the chain for drums, bass, vocals, guitar, keyboards? It does make a difference. It's going to sound different, but there is no hard and fast rule. So if you boost on an EQ and then saturate, it's going to sound differently to saturating than boosting. Not massively differently, and for the most part, it's not something you really need to worry about. But yes, it is going to sound different. It's just not something really to worry about, and you can always just kind of experiment and try swapping them around. But again, unless there's a very specific situation where boosting first and then saturating just isn't working for some reason, or I'm trying to solve a problem that necessitates doing one before the other. Otherwise, I'm just not really thinking about it too much. Is it better to use saturation on the vocal chain of the actual track, or better to set it up on a bus? So this is the difference between just kind of direct saturation and parallel saturation. So when you apply saturation directly to the vocal, you're saturating the entire signal, assuming you're not kind of using any like multi-band or tonal shift on that. You're just saturating every single frequency that's happening by a second or third order harmonic and beyond. Whereas when you do it on a bus, or if you load up a plugin and just change the wet dry knob, for example, if we pull up this vocal here, we could create a bus and then kind of tuck it in underneath. But we can also just go to a lot of plugins have this, the dry wet knob, and that basically is changing the balance between the original signal and the wet signal, as if you made a bus and tucked it underneath, or as if you duplicated the channel and tucked it underneath, and they just sound slightly different. So if we go all wet but like a lower drive,
does use fear for a change, fuel for my body.
We're saturating the entire signal, and we're kind of losing the original because everything's saturated. Versus, dialing in really aggressive saturation.
Does use fear for a change.
And then tucking it in underneath.
Does use fear for a change. Fuel for my body.
That can often sound a little bit more natural because we're maintaining that original signal while introducing a new signal. And especially if we brighten it up, that's a classic trick on vocals, is kind of parallel saturation that's quite bright. It adds a lot of high frequency content, but we can kind of maintain the integrity of the original. But it really just depends. You could do either. It can work well doing it directly. It's just try both, see what works with the context that you're working with. Okay, now I'm going to walk you through a couple of real world mixes to actually show you all of this applied in context. So there's two tracks here, two recent mixes I've done that have both been quite heavy on saturation. So we're going to be focusing a little bit more on that kind of creative use, because if I pulled up mixes that are subtle saturation, it might just be one or two saturation plugins or a little bit of tape saturation on the master, that kind of thing. So it wouldn't be particularly interesting to look at. But in these cases, it's a lot more heavy-handed, and you can kind of get the context on when that might be appropriate and how to think about that. So this mix here, the artist was in the room with me. You can actually watch this if you want on our YouTube channel, if you want to watch the mix itself. I'll link to that in the description. I was going for like quite a clean sound, especially with this kick drum and the percussion. It's like a pure sine wave. It's actually like a synth with a separate punch. Almost like Tom York-esque, quite glitchy. So I was going like relatively clean, but the artist was in the room with me and they said they wanted to really kind of mess it up a bit. I think they said like make it a bit less beautiful, something to that effect. So we can have a look at like all the different applications. So already here on the drums, and this is just the drums, not the kick. So we kept the click pretty clean. There's nothing on the kick itself other than anything that might be on the mix bus, which we'll come back to. And then you can see here decapitator, which is very typical. Without. Bit too clean. Reverb is kind of baked in as well. So nothing crazy. It's not kind of like noticeably breaking up, but it is adding a lot of kind of excitement. And that's a very common trait with saturation. Anytime we want anything to sound more aggressive, more in your face, or emotionally just higher energy, whether that's kind of like angry or also just kind of like elated, then we can start to saturate things a bit more. Something we haven't spoken a ton about yet is how saturation affects mood and emotion. And if we look at our 4 emotions cheat sheet here, the basic concept is in kind of psychology, there's this idea of arousal and valence. And valence is kind of negative or unpleasant emotions versus positive or pleasant emotions. That's valence. And then we also have arousal, which is like high arousal is like high energy, low arousal being kind of like low energy and subdued. So if you're kind of negative valence and low arousal, that would be like sad, versus negative valence and high arousal would be like angry. Equally, if we're thinking about kind of positive emotions, we can have kind of like positive but subdued, which might be this kind of like calm or serene feeling, or positive but high arousal, energetic. So that could be like happy, elation, ecstasy, those kind of emotions. And going from left to right is largely dictated by kind of like tone. When we go darker with EQ, or literally using our tone knob on decapitator, that tends to kind of shift it towards negative valence. To me, even harmonics have a bit more of that kind of that feel to them, especially if I'm using like open compressor. I just notice that, and this is up for interpretation as anything with kind of emotions, but for me personally, even harmonics have this kind of this darker, warmer sound to them. And that can literally be using the tone control on your saturation, darker for kind of like sadder or lower valence, brighter for happier or higher valence. And that's our kind of left to right. And then for like up and down or high arousal versus low arousal, it's just the amount of saturation. When something's really saturated, but in a way that's quite dark, that can have this like angry, or especially kind of like upper mids will add to that high arousal. So if we're kind of like upper mid centric, highly saturated, but also with like an overall kind of dark sound, that can feel quite angry, versus kind of like an oversaturated but brighter sound that can kind of lift things up and lead to this kind of positive uplift in how it feels. So something to think about. We've got a whole video on our YouTube channel that I'll link to as well that goes through this framework and how to mix with emotion. I'll talk about saturation there. So to come back to this mix, the way that this is impacting the drums is it's kind of lifting the energy, lifting the arousal. So we're not going for like relaxed, chilled. The artist literally said less beautiful. Like we don't want this kind of like beautiful, clean, serene sound. We're going for like more aggressive, higher arousal, higher energy. So not noticeably breaking it up, but now listen to it with that kind of emotional shift in mind. How does it feel bypass versus how does it feel when that saturation comes in? Also notice that I've got a really high amount of drive, and then I'm using the dry wet knob. So this is actually parallel saturation. The wet signal, really aggressive, and then we're just kind of blending it in underneath. Still relatively subtle. We're not trying to like literally just make everything massively distorted, even though the goal here was to make it quite dirty. So you still need to exercise some restraint for sure, even when you're going for this kind of creative, intentional use of aggressive saturation. So moving on from there, we've also got our bass. Again, relatively uncommon. Let's have a listen to what's going on with that, because we've got two different bass instruments. We've got our synth, which I've left basically, pun intended, unprocessed. So this is our sine wave. Like I was saying earlier, we don't want to saturate this because it's going to start to mess with it. We're going to lose that low end emphasis. It's going to shift all of the energy higher up in the spectrum. So if we want that kind of clean, weighty low end, we don't want to do anything to that really. Same with 808s, they're basically sine waves. You don't need to compress them, you don't need to EQ them or anything. The cleaner, the better. And then we've also got this Rhodes bass, which is already pretty dirty, very different sound. The two combined gives us the best of both. So then I was just dirtying that up even more. Again with Decapitator. Just brightening it up a bit. Again, lifting that energy. Very similar settings. I might have literally just copied this across. So like quite high amount of drive, but then tucked in underneath with the dry wet. When we listen to the two combined, this is without. With. Just adding a bit of width as well. So again, still relatively subtle. Then we have another instance of Decapitator, this time on DBL, which is the vocal double. So this is without. And then with the lead vocal. So the lead vocal itself, I went through hardware. So that did also have quite a lot of saturation on it. You can watch the full breakdown on our YouTube if you want to see that. I can't run through that here because it's already printed onto the vocal. But I ran that through a distressor with the saturation turned on that. So that's hardware saturation circuitry on the distressor. And then on the double, I didn't want to run that through the hardware. It's more work. I was already using it for the lead vocal. So we've just got an instance of Decapitator. Similar again. But this is where I'm also kind of using it as an EQ in a sense. So we're adding drive in parallel, slightly higher mix, but you can also see this tone shift. So sometimes when you're doing this, when you're applying saturation, it negates the need for EQ because we can achieve a similar outcome with saturation instead. And if you're planning on using saturation, you can lean on that a little bit more for your tonal shift that you need. If you want to brighten things up, you can just lean on your saturation. If you were planning on being a lot cleaner, then you might lean a little bit more on EQ. And of course, you can use both. This also has Pro Q on it, but I'm not boosting the top end. I'm just controlling some muddiness and some kind of harshness in the upper mid range. So then the way we're shifting things tonally brighter, increasing that arousal, just kind of make it higher energy and like dirty it up a bit, is with the saturation. Stained glass can ever be turned to colored sand. So that's the double. We've got similar thing on the BVs. So again, really brightening things up and making them more aggressive. Decapitator again. So this is where you can see kind of the power of Decapitator. These are probably using different modes as well. So this is mode N on the BVs, whereas on the double, there's also N. On the Rhodes bass, A, mode A. And then I think it was probably mode A again on the drums. Oh, there you go, P. So even though we're using the same plugin over and over again, this is why I love Decapitator, is you have these different styles. So it's like we've got 5 different saturators in one, all based on different hardware models. So yeah, even though we're using it over and over again, it's not actually getting like too repetitive or too similar. Because if you did use the same saturation every single place, it might start to become a bit too much, or like whatever the tonal characteristics of that saturator were would start to stack over time. And that could maybe kind of blend things together a little bit more. Using different saturation means that we're just going to get like different tonal shifts, which is going to create a little bit more contrast. Also kind of like separate things a little bit so that we don't get too much like frequency masking from kind of doing the same processing to lots of different things. So that's going to create that separation, a little bit more width, a little bit more depth because of that. So then we have the guitar as well. Acoustic guitar. And I think I went quite heavy on this as well because it's playing quite a supporting role. But again, we're trying to make things less beautiful. We're trying to like dirty it up just because emotionally that was the intent, stylistically, in terms of the artist's taste, the production style, especially as we get towards the end, it kind of like builds up to this kind of chaotic section. So we want to enhance that sense of chaos basically. And saturation is obviously going to help with that. So this is 100% wet. So we're not doing any kind of like parallel here, and quite a lot of drive. So this is without. With. So that's really breaking it up. And in solo, you might be like, why the hell would you do that? But let's listen to it in context. I'll bring it up a bit. So we are at minus 1.2. I'll bring it up so you can hear. So another thing that I hear is saturation just makes things more interesting. It's more for your ear to kind of latch onto. It's a form of ear candy where something that's just kind of like dry and was like sitting there in the background, wasn't really noticeable, just kind of like blending in. Now suddenly it's got a lot more character, it's a lot more interesting. Then moving on from that, I think we get to the mix bus. Oh, actually, before we do the mix bus, we've also got this drum spring. So we haven't spoken about this much. In terms of your aux channels, your reverbs, that kind of stuff. Saturation on reverb, less common. Saturation on delay, really common. So a lot of plugins like Echo Boy, any kind of tape delay plugins or hardware, you get tape saturation. And they tend to actually have a really nice sound to them. Like some people will use tape delays and not actually use it as a delay. They'll literally just kind of use like one repetition just to get kind of the sonic characteristic. You can see here on these Echo Boys, I've got saturation turned down to 0, but it has got a saturation knob in there. And then we've got this really quirky drum spring. This was actually the artist's suggestion. So I think it's just the entire drum channel sent to sprint. That's meant to say spring. And it's a spring reverb, which isn't something I do that often. But again, we're going for like vibey, interesting ear candy stuff. And then this is also quite heavily crushed with Decapitator. So this is without. Bit too clean. Something else you notice there is we're getting that compression. It's leveling it out rather than kind of those different hits poking out. It just creates this kind of more smeared, constant sound. You can do that on reverbs too if you want to create this kind of more aggressive, more constant level of room tone. So if we have a listen to the drums. Brings it to the forefront a lot more. That's another thing. Saturation tends to push things closer to you. So when we think about kind of width and depth, We can add stereo width with saturation if we're applying stereo saturation, like a lot of tape saturation or stereo, literal kind of like stereo plugins. They might have variations between the left and right that when we add saturation, it increases width. But we can also play around with that front to back depth. If something's quite clean, it's going to feel further away. When it's saturated, it's more in your face. Again, we go more towards this kind of like high arousal, like angry. If you think of anger, it's like aggressive and in your face. So we're pulling it forward for a couple of reasons. One, we're leveling it out. So we're actually bringing up those quieter parts. So that kind of pulls it forwards. Then we're also brightening it up a bit. That's going to feel like it's closer compared to something darker, feels like it's further away. But also just that kind of aggressive quality of saturation makes it sound more in your face. So if we wanted to push this back, I probably wouldn't opt for that. But I thought it was a really cool element that we added, so I actually wanted to like bring it further forwards. Without it, it just kind of gets lost in the background. Bringing that in, suddenly it kind of pulls it forwards. It does also have this flattening effect. That's something to be aware of. When you use saturation a lot, or if you use aggressive saturation on an entire mix, you are going to kind of flatten it and pull it towards you. It's more in your face, but you're losing some of that front to back depth. So again, it's not a good or a bad thing. There's just different situations. Certain songs, certain genres, you might want this like kind of enveloping depth to it, and other times you want it just flatten in your face. It's just something to be aware of. In terms of the mix bus, I'm probably using some subtle, odd and even on the compressor. So not hugely noticeable, but subtle saturation on the mix bus is crazy. I love it. It always baffles me how much it can do in a way that's quite subtle. We're adding to my ears a bit of a kind of smiley face sound. It's also enhancing the depth though. And if we applied really heavy saturation, it feels like it pushes things and squashes them. But when we use subtle saturation, we're introducing new harmonic content, and that can have this kind of subsequent impact of it actually sounding deeper and wider. Listen out for that as I flick back and forth. It's like suddenly there's space that appears in the middle of the mix. And I will say this is because I spent a lot of time fine-tuning the odd and even controls on Open Compressor, but tape saturation will do that as well. I just really like the sound of the Open Compressor saturation, specifically on the mix bus. As you can see, my go-to for like individual channels is a lot more decapitator, but these days this is like the main form of saturation I'm using on my mix bus, because I'll use this as my kind of mix bus compressor, or if I'm mastering, I'll use it as my mastering compressor, and then it's just right there. It's really handy. So just kind of switch it on. It's on by default. Now we're going to look at Chewing on the Curb by Paul House. And this was another really interesting mix where this time it wasn't the artist that was in the room with me, but the producers. And we did an early version of the mix that sounded too good. It didn't really fit with their vision for the mix, and it was just a little bit too high fidelity. The vibe that they were going for with this is kind of like a throwback, kind of like geek rock-esque track. And it wasn't meant to be like a pop track. It's meant to sound like it was recorded in a garage, but in a way that's high fidelity and highly intentional. I think that's something people get confused about. They think that high production value means full, and kind of that high fidelity means really clean. But you can have high production value while still going for like a really dirty sound. So it was just that the first version was a little bit too clean. And I'll show you a quick comparison here. So this was the modern mix.
Walk your dog straight to the pound. Bad dreams get loud every time
and then this was the dark and dirty. And I'll show you what the difference was. But for now, just listen to the difference high level.
Walk your dog straight to the pound. Bad dreams get loud. Better is what it is, just what it is. Better is what it is, just what it is. Don't ask me. Nothing I say is gonna make it better. Nothing I do is make it better. Nothing I do is gonna make it worse.
Again, focus on kind of like the feeling, the difference in feeling between them. Very different. And while my personal style and preference would probably lean more towards the modern version, that's why I mix it that way, I understand that the artist vision and the producer vision for that was different, and it was a little bit too modern, too sterile, maybe a bit boring, versus something that is just a bit dirtier, a bit darker, has a very different feel to it. Now, the way that that was actually achieved, we'll go through all the different instances of, you guessed it, Decapitator. But the difference between the modern version and the dark version was two kind of big moves. So I kind of, mixed everything, mastered it here as well to the point where I liked it. Then we decided it's too bright, it's too modern, let's make it a bit darker and a bit dirtier. So I literally just cut quite an aggressive high shelf, everything above 4K down by 4.6 decibels. So this is before.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter, it is what it is.
And after.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter, it is what it is what it is. Last week was the worst week ever. Nothing I changed gonna break this curse. Hole in my heart and a hole in my sweater is what it is, just what it is.
So that was the first move. That's the dark move. And then there's the dirty move, which is Decapitator on the entire mix and quite aggressively. So this is without.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter, it is what it is what it is.
And this is with.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter, it is what it is what it is. Last week was the worst week ever. Nothing I changed gonna break this curse. Hole in my heart and a hole in my sweater is what it is, just what it is.
So it really collapses that front to back depth. It adds way more energy, way more arousal. Again, if we think about the four emotions framework, we've gone from somewhere that's probably quite neutral or even like happy, quite bright and subdued, like bordering on calm if it was like too clean. And we've gone darker, which is negative valence, going to shift it to this side of the emotions, and way more saturated, higher arousal, which is going to shift it up here. So we kind of get into like angry territory. And I think that is what this track needed. If I listen to this track as a listener, not as a kind of, mixer or someone who likes the sound of things that sound nice, and instead I focus on, okay, what's this track actually saying? What are the lyrics saying? What's the emotion that's being put across? And it is basically anger. It's an interesting combination of kind of happiness, but also anger. The title's called Chewing on the Curb. So, literally, I imagine that as like face planting the curb. Probably not a very pleasant experience. That might actually have a meaning, chewing on the curb. Maybe that's like an American saying, I don't know. But that's where we're trying to shift things. So we go dark, we go dirty, but that has a lot of other knock-on consequences. So we've kind of shifted it to higher energy, higher arousal and darker, so kind of towards anger. But what we've also done is collapse the depth. So it's way more in your face. Again, that enhances the anger. It just creates a very different listening experience. And it doesn't feel like kind of a warm hug that's wrapping around us. Now it really is this kind of in your face sound.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter, it is what it is what it is.
The other thing to notice is the increase in volume, significant increase in volume. And obviously we could volume match this, but one of the kind of side effects of saturation that we've touched on a little bit when it comes to clipping, shaving off those peaks, compression, kind of leveling everything out a little bit. And the combined impact is that saturation has quite a significant impact on both perceived loudness, because we're adding new harmonic content, even if something is matched to the same perceived loudness. If we match the LUFS level, it would sound louder if it's saturated because there's just more harmonic content. Generally, there's also more, upper, mids, and high frequency content, which our ears are more perceptible to. So it sounds louder in that regard. But you also compress and shave off some transients. So not only is it perceived loudness that increases, it's perceived loudness and actual loudness. And what I mean by that is we can have a look at the level going into my limiter here. So without.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter. It is what it is what it is.
We're barely touching the limiter, minus 0.7. I did have another limiter on this, which we can emulate. Then we bring in the saturation.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter. It is what it is what it is.
Minus 0.6. So basically the limiter's working just as hard, the same amount of gain reduction, but the volume difference
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter. It is what
is significant. And if we look at the LUFS level, so this is basically with no limiting. This was just like a kind of some safe limiting to make sure it's not clipping. We're not actually pushing it into a limiter yet, and we're already
doing on the curb like a real go-getter. It is what it is what it is.
We're already at minus 8 short-term LUFS, which is pretty loud. We generally advise people to be around kind of like minus 9, minus 11. We haven't even limited it yet. So if we then add on our kind of final limiter, use the waves L4 and push in a few, maybe 3 to 5 dB of gain reduction, which would be pretty typical. We can play around with these different modes.
Doing on the curb like a real go-getter. It is what it is what it is.
We're not pushing that limiter that hard, but you can see we get up to minus 4 short-term LUFS, which is incredibly loud. But I'm not pushing the limiters hard. The reason it's so loud is because of the saturation. If we turn that off,
doing on the curb like a real go-getter. It is what it is.
the limiters are doing the same thing. We've got like tickling it here, minus 0.7, and around 3 to 5 dB of gain reduction on this limiter. And we've gone from like minus 4 to minus 7.5. So it's kind of a nice, in this case, unintended consequence of being aggressive with saturation. It really helps with loudness, which you may or may not care about, but something to be aware of. And if there are situations where you're working on a rock track, especially where you can get away with more saturation, and your goal is to make it really loud, you can lean on saturation a lot. In this case, it was actually not the goal. The goal was tonal. I wanted to make the mix sound and feel a certain way, and the loudness was kind of a consequential or side benefit of that. But obviously you could flip it, and if you want it loud, saturation is going to really help. So that was the main thing I wanted to show you on this mix. There are instances of decapitator throughout, and we've got some decapitator on the snare. So this is without, with. So quite aggressive, fully wet, and quite a lot of drive. That's adding a lot of energy and kind of enhances the actual snares in the snare rail. We also have on the lead vocals, open compressor, a couple of instances of that. Kind of like, yeah, so we're doing like serial compression, so 2 compressors in a row, and on the second one I'm using like subtle saturation. I think I did experiment with decapitator, but I think I turned this off when I added the decapitator on the mix bus. So in the modern version, there's saturation on the vocal, but not the whole mix. Then I started saturating the whole mix, and it was just too much on the vocal, so I bypassed that. Okay, we've reached the end of the course. I hope you found this helpful. You're basically a pro at saturation now. While you could go deeper into the maths, if you wanted to go anywhere from here, you could definitely do that. The main thing I wanted to focus on here was the practical application, how to think about it, kind of the strategy behind saturation. You need to have a deep enough level of understanding that you know what it's doing under the hood, and just really understand the kind of the odd even element of it. But beyond that, I think the main thing is experiment with different plugins, knowing your tools, understanding the context, and just revisit this course anytime you want to recap any of that. The important thing is you now go and apply this, so it isn't just knowledge rattling around in your head, and it actually turns into learnt knowledge, practical, applied behavior. The fact that you made it all the way to the end of this course means you'd probably be a really good candidate for our full audio program. We have a multi-year producing, mixing and mastering program called the Reverse Engineer. We actually start with mastering and teach in reverse. So we teach you mastering to a professional level. We spend several months on that. That gives you a lot of clarity on the end goal, what you're actually working towards, and then you can reverse engineer the rest of the process. It also helps you learn the technical foundation first, so that then when you're mixing and you're producing, you're not hitting constant technical road hurdles. And instead, you approach those processes in a way that allows you to stay in a state of flow, because you know what you're doing, you know what the tools mean, you know what knobs do what, and then you can just stay in this creative flow. There are a lot of other reasons why we do that. But we start with mastering, then we teach mixing, we spend several months on that, and finally production. So we cover the whole process, just starting with mastering. It includes extensive one-to-one mentorship. We've got a training platform, an extremely active community, some incredible mentors, world-class mentors, Grammy-winning mentors like Austin, Jux Chandler, who's worked with Adele, Manon Grandjean, who is one of the top mixing engineers and mastering engineers here in the UK, Kevin McCloskey, who you all know and love. He's worked with some incredible artists, is multi-platinum, Grammy-nominated. You can watch some of our kind of stories from students and testimonials on our website. Just go to mastering.com to learn more. We also offer full and partial scholarships for the program. So again, the fact that you've made it to the end of this video puts you in a good position for a scholarship. That's something you can lean into a little bit more. You're clearly committed. That's really what we're looking for when it comes to these scholarships. You don't have to be at a certain level. It's just that you're extremely passionate, extremely committed. You're going to be a really positive addition to the community, and you're going to be a great student. So I'll include a link below to apply for a scholarship. This isn't something that we offer everywhere, and you may as well apply, see if you can get a full ride scholarship. We offer those every once a month or so, and then also partial scholarships. We have a few of those to offer out each month too. So if you want to apply for a scholarship, I'll leave a link in the description. You can also learn more at mastering.com. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. YouTube thinks you would like this one, so go and check it out, and I hope to see you again soon.